The first letter came down with a metallic groan. The giant W that had hung above the Whitaker Grand for more than 30 years tilted away from the brick facade, swung from a crane cable, and scraped the wall hard enough to send flakes of white paint onto the sidewalk. The July air smelled of lake water, damp wood, and hot metal. My father stood across the street with both hands at his sides. Charles Whitaker had spent half his life making sure people saw his name before they saw the hotel. That morning, he watched a construction crew remove it one letter at a time. A worker lowered the W beside the loading dock and called to Rosa Delgado. "Do you want these saved?" Rosa, now the director of operations, glanced at me before answering. "Put them in evidence storage. They are not going back up." My father looked at me then. He did not apologize. He did not ask me to stop them. By that point, there was nothing left for me to stop. 13 months earlier, he had believed one guest list and one locked gate would make me small enough to control. Before I tell you how 10 black limousines changed my sister's wedding, I hope you are doing well. Stay with me to see what happened next, and please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories about families who finally face the consequences of their choices. On the morning of Brielle's wedding, I drove from Madison to Lake Mercer in 85 minutes. I did not make the trip because I missed my parents. I did not expect a tearful reconciliation, a place at the family table, or an apology for the 5 years they had spent calling me a thief. I went because my sister had promised to give me a box of old records after the ceremony, and 3 days earlier, someone had sent me a payroll summary that should not have existed. The document listed dozens of small deductions from employees at the Whitaker Grand. The deductions were labeled as uniform fees, meal charges, training costs, service adjustments, and overtime corrections. Each one was small enough to look ordinary by itself. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized. I had seen that pattern before. My lawyer knew where I was going. A copy of the report was already outside my phone and in her files. Marcus Bell was waiting with 32 current and former hotel employees at a staging lot 10 minutes from Lake Mercer. A separate transportation contract, signed in my name and paid from my savings, held 10 vehicles for a narrow window that afternoon. The retainer had cost me $4,800. If I was wrong, I would lose every cent. I hoped I was wrong. The Whitaker Grand appeared beyond a curve in the road, its pale brick walls rising above the trees beside the lake. White flowers lined the driveway. Cream ribbons moved in the warm breeze. From a distance, the place looked exactly as my mother wanted it to look. Elegant, peaceful, and untouched by anything ugly. I parked near the west lawn and checked Brielle's last message again. "Come to the wedding. After the ceremony, I will give you the box from the old office. Please do not make this harder than it has to be." She had not said what was inside the box. She had not answered when I asked why she had waited 5 years to mention it. I slipped my phone into my purse and walked toward the main entrance. The glass doors opened into the lobby I had once managed. The same brass luggage carts stood beside the front desk. The same grandfather clock marked the minutes with a low wooden click. Near the staircase, a framed plaque read Family Employer of the Year. Maribel Soto, one of the banquet attendants, was polishing the glass over it. She looked exhausted. Sweat had darkened the hair near her temples, and the sleeve of her white uniform had a faint gray stain near the cuff. When she noticed me, the cloth stopped moving in her hand. "Dana, you came," she said quietly. "How long have you been here?" Her eyes flicked toward the ballroom corridor. "Since before 6. It was almost 2 in the afternoon. Are they paying overtime?" Before she could answer, my mother's voice came from behind me. "Dana, I see you made it." Diane Whitaker crossed the lobby in a pale blue dress with a corsage pinned to one shoulder. Her smile was careful and public, the kind she used when donors were watching. Maribel immediately returned to polishing the plaque. My mother kissed the air beside my cheek. "You should not distract the staff today. Everyone is under pressure." I asked her one question, and today is not about your questions. She placed a light hand on my elbow and guided me toward the garden doors. Through the glass, I saw rows of white chairs facing the lake. Brielle stood near the floral arch in her wedding dress while a photographer adjusted her veil. My sister saw me. For 1 second, neither of us moved. Then she looked down at the flowers in her hands. "Where is my seat?" I asked. Mother's fingers tightened slightly around my arm. "There has been an adjustment." "Of course there has. Do not begin." "I have not begun anything." My father appeared from the side corridor carrying a clipboard. At 67, Charles Whitaker still moved through the hotel as if every floorboard had been placed for him personally. His tuxedo fit perfectly. His expression did not. He stopped in front of me and held out the clipboard. It was the wedding guest list. "We are short at the entrance," he said. "You can check names until the ceremony starts." I looked at the list, then at him. "You invited me to work the gate?" "Do not be dramatic. It is 45 minutes." A few relatives near the garden doors had already turned toward us. My aunt lowered her champagne glass. One of Brielle's cousins gave an embarrassed laugh. Father's mouth curved at one corner. "At least you are useful as security." The words were designed to put me back where my family had kept me for 5 years, outside and disgraced, close enough to serve them but not close enough to belong. I took the clipboard. My mother's smile relaxed. My father thought he had won before the ceremony had even started. Then I looked down. The list was arranged by surname, table number, and meal choice. Some names had been crossed out in blue ink. Others were marked in red. Beside several of the crossed-out names were the codes U, M, T, S, and OT, none of which had anything to do with seating or food. The edge of the paper pressed into my palm as my grip tightened. Those were not wedding codes. They were payroll codes. The letters stood for uniform, meal, training, service distribution, and overtime. The same sequence appeared on the anonymous report sitting in my lawyer's file. I turned the page. Rosa Delgado, Marcus Bell, Maribel Soto, Elijah Brooks, and Eddie Walsh had all been crossed out. Beside Rosa's name, someone had written "valid invitation, hold at service entry." My father had not handed me a simple guest list. He had handed me a map. "You want me to control this gate?" I asked. He glanced toward the garden, already losing interest in me. "That is what I just said." "Then do not complain about who I let through." He gave a dry laugh. "Just follow the list, Dana, for once." I carried the clipboard to the stone gate at the end of the main drive. A young security guard stood beside a folding table, but father sent him toward the service entrance as soon as I arrived. That left me alone with the list. I photographed every page. Then I sent the images to my lawyer and to Marcus. His reply came almost immediately. "Call when you are certain." Cars continued arriving. I greeted guests, checked names, and pointed them toward the garden. Some recognized me and avoided my eyes. Others offered polite smiles that carried the weight of the story my parents had told them. Dana stole from the family hotel. Dana ran when she was caught. Dana was jealous because Brielle had saved the business. I had spent 5 years learning that a lie did not need to be believable forever. It only needed to be repeated until the truth became inconvenient. A black sedan pulled up. Owen Mercer's parents stepped out, thanked me, and walked inside. Owen's mother paused as if she wanted to say something. Then followed her husband. Beyond the gate, staff members moved flower stands, carried trays, and directed guests through the main doors. None of them used those doors themselves. Every uniformed employee entered and left through the narrow service passage beside the kitchen. 3 doors had always defined the Whitaker Grand. The front entrance was for people my family wanted to impress. The service door was for the people who kept the hotel alive. The side gate was for anyone my parents wanted to control without making a scene. That afternoon, they put me at the side gate and gave me control of the only list that mattered. My phone vibrated. Marcus had sent a photograph from the staging lot. I could see the corner of Rosa's formal dress, Eddie's polished shoes, and a row of black vehicles behind them. I called him. He answered on the first ring. "Do they match?" he asked. I looked again at the codes beside the names. Then I looked toward the lobby, where Maribel was still polishing an award that praised my parents for treating employees like family. "The names match," I said. "Bring them." I ended the call. For the next several minutes, nothing changed. The quartet played near the garden. Guests laughed near the garden. My father crossed the lawn shaking hands. My mother posed beneath the hotel sign with Brielle and Owen. Then, the first black limousine turned into the driveway. A second followed it, then a third. By the time the 10th vehicle rolled through the gate, conversations near the entrance had stopped. The limousines moved slowly up the circular drive, dark and polished beneath the June sun. My father noticed them from the garden and straightened his jacket. He said something to my mother. Her face brightened as she waved urgently at the photographer. They thought wealthy guests had arrived. They thought investors had changed their minds and come to celebrate the Whitaker family. My father walked toward the lead vehicle before it had fully stopped. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Rosa Delgado emerged in a dark green dress, one hand holding a cream wedding invitation. In the other, she carried the old brass name tag she had worn for 19 years at the Whitaker Grand. My father extended his hand. "Welcome," he said, as if he had not crossed her name off the list. Rosa walked straight past him. She stopped in front of me and placed the name tag in my palm. Her fingers trembled, but her voice did not. "5 years ago, I let them leave you standing alone," she said. "Not tonight." Behind her, the other 9 limousine doors began to open. The remaining limousine doors opened almost at once. Men and women stepped onto the driveway in formal clothes instead of hotel uniforms. Some wore dresses that looked newly purchased. Others had pressed old suits until every seam held sharp. I recognized people from housekeeping, maintenance, the kitchen, banquet service, laundry, and the front desk. They had spent years entering the Whitaker Grand through a narrow service door beside the dumpsters. That afternoon, they arrived in polished black cars and stood beneath the main entrance as invited guests. My father turned slowly, counting faces. His hand dropped from the greeting position he had held for whoever he expected to find inside the first car. "What is this?" he demanded. Rosa remained in front of me. The brass name tag in my palm was warm from her hand. Her name was scratched across the surface from 19 years of use, but the letters were still clear. "This is not the place for an apology," she said quietly. "Not yet. I only needed you to know why I came." Before I could answer, Charles moved between us. "You people need to get back into those cars." No one moved. Maribel Soto stood beside Rosa in a plum-colored dress, her hair no longer pinned beneath the cap she wore during banquet shifts. Elijah Brooks, one of the line cooks, adjusted the cuffs of a dark suit that looked slightly too tight across his shoulders. Eddie Walsh, who had repaired nearly every pipe and boiler in the hotel, leaned on a polished wooden cane and stared at my father without blinking. Behind them, the other employees gathered in small groups. They were not chanting. They were not holding protest signs. No one raised a fist or pulled out a phone to record a performance. They simply stayed. A man stepped out of the final limousine and walked toward me. Marcus Bell had more gray at his temples than the last time I had seen him, but his stride was the same, measured and deliberate. He stopped beside me and nodded toward the line of vehicles. 10 cars, 32 passengers, 1 short transfer agreement, he said. Signed by you, billed to you, and completely separate from the reservation Brielle canceled. My father's eyes narrowed. Those vehicles were booked for this wedding. Your daughter canceled the employee portion of that booking on Wednesday, Marcus said. My company released the original service and accepted a new contract from Dana on Thursday. These cars are here legally, and every driver has the paperwork. Marcus did not sound triumphant. He sounded like the operations manager he had become after my family destroyed his reputation and forced him to rebuild it somewhere else. Charles looked at me. You spent thousands of dollars to stage this? I spent my own money to give invited guests transportation. They are employees. They are people. My mother came down the garden path with one hand holding up the hem of her dress. Diane never ran in public, but she was walking fast enough to make her corsage shake against her shoulder. What have you done? She asked me. I checked the list. Her gaze moved from my face to the employees, then to the limousine drivers standing beside their vehicles. For a moment, her expression lost its practiced softness. This is Brielle's wedding, she said. Whatever grievance you think you have can wait. Rosa reached into her purse and removed a cream envelope. So can we, she said, inside. My father gave a short laugh. You are not going inside. Rosa opened the envelope and held out an invitation, bearing her name and a printed confirmation code. Maribel did the same. Then Elijah. Then Eddie. Around them, more envelopes appeared. My father looked at the invitations as though the paper itself had betrayed him. "These were revoked," he said. "No one told us that," Maribel answered. "We received the invitations, the cocktail hour schedule, and instructions about the employee photograph." My mother stepped forward. "There was a misunderstanding. The photograph was cancelled when the schedule changed. Then why were our names still on the original list?" Eddie asked. No one answered him. I turned the clipboard so my father could see the pages he had placed in my hands. Their names were printed, assigned confirmation codes, and crossed out later. Some were marked for the service entrance, even though their invitations said main reception. Diane's eyes snapped toward Charles. He stared at the list as if he had never seen the handwritten notes. That was how my parents worked when a plan began to fail. They did not defend it together. They looked for the first person they could blame for knowing too much. Charles signaled to a security guard near the garden doors. "Get these people off the property." The young guard hesitated. He had worked at the Whitaker Grand for less than a year, but he knew Rosa. Everyone who had ever needed a clean room, a lost wedding ring found, or a sick child comforted while they waited for an ambulance knew Rosa. He approached slowly. "Mr. Whitaker, they have invitations. They are no longer valid." "Then show me the cancellation notice," I said. My father turned on me. "You do not run this hotel. You told me to control the gate. I told you to follow the list. I am following the printed list. You are asking me to follow handwritten changes no one communicated to the guests." A few wedding guests had drifted closer. I recognized local business owners, distant relatives, and 2 members of the county tourism board. Their presence made my mother straighten her shoulders. She lowered her voice. "Dana, do not create a spectacle. I did not send 32 invitations." Brielle appeared at the end of the path, her white skirt brushing over the grass. Owen followed her, looking from the limousines to the crowd at the gate. My sister's face tightened when she saw Rosa and Marcus. She gathered her dress with both hands and came toward us. "Why are they here?" she asked. Maribel lifted her invitation. "Because you invited us." Brielle barely glanced at it. "Those were preliminary." "You sent confirmation emails," Elijah said. "That was before the final seating plan." "We were told to arrive for cocktail hour and a photograph," Maribel replied. "We were told the hotel wanted to celebrate the employees who made this place feel like family." The words hung between us beneath the Family Employer of the Year plaque visible through the lobby doors. Owen looked at Brielle. "What employee photograph?" She turned toward him without releasing her grip on the dress. "It was a branding idea. We decided it would interfere with the ceremony." "You showed me the sample video," he said. "The one about 3 generations of the Whitaker family and the staff who built the hotel with them." Brielle forced a small smile. "Exactly. It was only promotional material." Rosa's voice remained calm. "We were invited as people when the camera needed us. We became staff again when we asked where our money went." Several employees shifted behind her. The statement changed the atmosphere more than shouting would have. Guests began looking from the invitations to my sister. Brielle's smile disappeared. "I do not know what Dana told you, but today is not the day for payroll complaints." "I have not told them anything they did not already see on their own paychecks," I said. Owen stepped closer to the table. He picked up one of the invitations and examined the printed code. "Is this genuine?" he asked Brielle. She did not answer quickly enough. "It came from the wedding account," Marcus said. "My company received the original transportation request with the same names attached." My father pointed toward him. "You were fired from this hotel. You have no right to interfere with our event." Marcus met his stare. "I am here as a contracted transportation manager. What happened 5 years ago is another conversation." Owen handed the invitation back to Rosa. "They can enter the cocktail reception while we verify the list." Brielle turned to him. "Owen, there are no seats for them. I am not asking anyone to start dinner. I am asking why people with valid invitations were brought here, removed without notice, and then told to use the service entrance. This is my family's hotel. It is our wedding." His voice was not loud, but it stopped her. Owen had not chosen my side. He had chosen to slow the situation down long enough to understand it, which was more than anyone in my family wanted him to do. My mother moved closer to Rosa and softened her expression. "Of course you may wait inside," she said. We will take you through the service corridor so you do not disrupt the guests. Rosa looked at the main entrance. The double glass doors stood open behind a pair of floral arrangements taller than I was. We are guests, she said. The lobby is crowded, Diane replied. The service entrance will be faster. Eddie leaned more heavily on his cane. I repaired those front doors after the winter freeze. I think they can hold us. A quiet laugh moved through some of the employees. It was not cruel, but my mother heard it as defiance. Her mouth tightened. This is unnecessary. No, Rosa said. It is overdue. I walked to the main doors and held one open. For a few seconds, no one moved. The employees had spent years learning that crossing an invisible line at the Whitaker Grand came with consequences. Even in formal clothes, even with invitations in their hands, the habit of waiting for permission remained. Maribel stepped forward first. She passed my mother without looking at her. Elijah followed, then Eddie, then the rest of the group in pairs and small clusters. Marcus stayed near the back, making sure no one was separated. Guests inside the lobby turned as the employees entered. Some recognized the people who had carried their luggage, cleaned their rooms, served their anniversary dinners, and found medicine for their children at midnight. Without uniforms, the employees looked unfamiliar to them for only a moment. Then they looked human. Above the entrance, the Family Employer of the Year plaque reflected the afternoon light. Maribel slowed beneath it. That morning, I had watched her polish the glass after working for nearly 8 hours. Now she walked under it as a guest, while my mother stood outside, trying to decide how to regain control. The ballroom staff had set up a side area for the cocktail reception. Owen asked the bartenders to bring water and soft drinks. He did not ask the employees to explain themselves in front of everyone. He only told Brielle he wanted the original invitation records and the final seating file. She said the wedding planner had them. My father told Owen not to let an ambush ruin the day. Owen replied, "Then help me confirm there is no ambush." Charles did not like being asked for proof inside his own hotel. I could see it in the way he pressed his thumb into the edge of his cufflink. I stayed near the lobby rather than following the employees into the reception area. Rosa stood several feet away from me. The space between us felt more honest than an embrace would have. "You kept the name tag," I said. She looked down at the brass plate in my hand. I could not wear it after they made me sign. My fingers closed around it. "We will talk about that." "Yes," she said, "when you are ready to hear something that will not make either of us feel better." She walked inside before I could answer. Marcus remained near me. "You knew she was coming?" I asked. "She was the first person to agree." "That does not answer my question." He watched Rosa join Maribel near the lobby staircase. "She has spent 5 years preparing to tell you what she did. She was never sure you would listen." I was not exactly easy to find. "No," he said, "you made sure of that." The truth in his voice irritated me because it belonged there. After my parents fired me, I had changed my number, moved to Madison, and refused every message connected to the hotel. I told myself I was protecting the employees from being dragged into the investigation. I had also made it impossible for anyone to stand beside me. Before I could answer Marcus, a young woman approached us. Tessa Green worked in payroll. I remembered her from the morning, moving boxes of place cards near the ballroom. But I had never met her before the report arrived in my email. She glanced toward Brielle and lowered her voice. "I need to show you something." She carried a slim folder beneath her shawl. Inside was a copy of her pay stub with one line highlighted. Training adjustment. The amount was $412. "What training?" I asked. "There was none." "Did you authorize this deduction?" "No." "Did anyone explain it?" "They said the accounting system was correcting a prior overpayment." She handed me a second page. It was an internal email sent to payroll supervisors 2 months earlier. The message listed total training adjustments scheduled across several pay periods. The combined amount was just over $18,000. Marcus opened his phone and searched through a folder. "Last month, one of the florists contacted our transportation office by mistake," he said. "They wanted confirmation that the wedding deposit had cleared because both vendors were listed under the same event coordinator." He showed me a copy of an invoice. The deposit for the floral installation was $18,000. The numbers did not prove the employee's money had paid for the flowers. A matching amount could be coincidence, poor accounting, or a transfer between accounts we had not seen. But it was enough to ask a question my family did not want asked. I looked at Tessa. Who else has seen your pay stub? My husband and Maribel. Do you want to show Owen? She hesitated. Not in front of everyone. Then we do not show it in front of everyone. A guest nearby had already raised her phone toward us. I stepped between the camera and the pages. No photographs, I said. These are payroll records. The woman lowered the phone, embarrassed. My father noticed the folder and crossed the lobby toward us. What are you passing around? Personal payroll documents, I said. They are not your wedding entertainment. They are hotel records. The pay stub belongs to the employee who received it. Charles reached for the folder. Tessa pulled it against her chest. For the first time, he looked directly at her. You work in payroll, do you not? Yes. Then you understand confidential information cannot be removed from the office. It is my pay stub, she said. The summary email was part of my assigned work. You are making a serious mistake. His tone changed the moment from an argument into a warning. Tessa's face lost color, but she did not step back. Owen came closer. What is the mistake? I explained only what we knew. Employees had received deductions labeled as training adjustments. An internal summary showed the combined amount. A wedding flower deposit carried a matching total. I also explained what we did not know. We had not traced the money through the bank. We could not yet claim the deductions paid the florist. My father looked almost relieved when I said that. There, he told Owen. Dana has found 2 numbers and built another accusation. Then the record should clear it up, Owen said. Brielle arrived beside him. Her eyes moved from Tessa's folder to Marcus's phone. Tessa, return whatever you took. I did not take anything outside my role. You sent her the report, did you not? Tessa froze. Brielle's reaction told me more than her question. She had not asked whether Tessa knew about the report. She had asked whether Tessa had sent it. Marcus shifted beside me, but I shook my head slightly. This was not the moment to force Tessa into a confession she had not chosen to make. She gave me her own pay stub, I said. That is all you need to know right now. Brielle looked at me. You think you are protecting her? I think she gets to decide what becomes public. My sister's jaw tightened. Tessa opened the folder again and pulled out one final page. I was asked to print this memo 3 weeks ago, she said. I kept a copy because the administrator code did not make sense. She showed me the top portion of an internal payroll instruction. It authorized another round of meal, training, uniform, and service adjustments across the hotel's hourly staff. The memo carried a profile code in the lower corner. Tvajeden. For a moment, the voices around me seemed to recede beneath the soft music coming from the garden. Those were my initials. DW01 had been the administrator profile assigned to me when I managed hotel operations. It should have been disabled when my key card was canceled in October of 2020. I looked at the creation date, 3 weeks before the wedding. My father leaned over Tessa's shoulder and saw the same code. His entire posture changed. The anger did not disappear. It sharpened into something more useful. He turned toward the guests gathering near the lobby. You all see this? He said loudly. Her administrator account is still authorizing payroll changes. That is a profile code, I said. It does not show who used it. It shows your name. It shows a system you controlled failed to remove an old profile. Charles faced me fully. You arrive with fired employees, private cars, payroll documents, and accusations. Now your administrator code appears on transactions made 3 weeks ago. Brielle stood behind him, watching Tessa rather than me. My mother said nothing. She did not need to. The old story had already begun rebuilding itself around us. My father raised his voice enough for the nearest wedding guests to hear every word. You never stopped stealing from us, did you? My father's accusation carried across the lobby and reached the guests clustered near the ballroom doors. Conversation stopped in widening circles. The quartet outside continued playing, unaware that the wedding had become something else. Tessa pressed the payroll memo against her chest. I could feel 32 employees watching me, waiting for the denial that would put everything back into a simple shape. I did not give them one. The code is mine, I said. That does not mean I used it. Charles lifted his chin, convenient. It should have been disabled when you removed my access 5 years ago. You expect everyone to believe your account remained active without your knowledge? I expect the system records to tell us which device used it. A murmur moved through the guests. My father had asked a moral question. I had answered with a technical one. He knew which version played better in a ballroom. Elijah came forward carrying his pay stub. We should put everything on the screen. He pointed toward the large display behind the head table. It currently showed a photograph of Brielle and Owen beside the lake. Every deduction, he continued, every check. Let the guests see what they paid for. Several employees agreed. Maribel had already taken out her phone. Another banquet server opened a folder of screenshots. No, I said. Elijah turned toward me. Why not? Because those documents contain addresses, tax information, employee numbers, and private benefit details. We have not traced the full movement of the money. Matching amounts are not proof of where each dollar went. They took it from us. I believe they did. You believe? I am not going to state something as fact until we can prove it. His expression hardened. That sounds familiar. I knew what he meant before he said it. 5 years ago you told us to wait, Elijah said. You said you were handling it, then you disappeared. I made the wrong decision then. And now you are deciding for us again. The words landed where they were supposed to. I had stopped the employees from exposing themselves, but I had not asked what they wanted. My reason was better than my father's. The habit was not as different as I wanted it to be. I lowered my voice. Anyone who chooses to share a document may do that. I am asking you not to display 30 people's private records without their permission. Elijah looked toward the others. A few nodded at him. Others looked relieved. You could have said that first, he replied. You are right. My father gave a thin smile. He had noticed the split. Before he could use it, Owen stepped between us. We are not discussing payroll in the middle of the lobby, he said. Dana, Brielle, come with me. Brielle's face tightened. The ceremony should have started 20 minutes ago. It will not start while your father is accusing your sister of theft in front of our guests. He is responding to what she brought here. Owen looked at the employees gathered beneath the staircase. She brought people you invited. My sister glanced at the cameras and lowered her voice. Not here. Owen led us into a waiting room beside the ballroom. The door remained open. Ava Chen, the wedding planner, joined us with her tablet. A hotel events supervisor stood near the doorway, close enough that no one could later claim the conversation had happened in secret. I stayed beside the open door. Brielle placed her bouquet on a table with more force than necessary. Dana planned this. I arranged transportation after receiving evidence that employees had been invited and then removed, I said. I did not create their invitations. Owen turned to Ava. Were the invitations genuine? Ava scrolled through the event account. Yes. 36 employee invitations were generated 6 weeks ago. 4 were declined. 32 were confirmed. When were they removed from the final seating file? She looked at the screen. 3 days ago. Owen faced Brielle. Why? The schedule changed. You already said that. What changed? The photography plan, the reception flow. We did not have space. The ballroom was designed for 220 guests, Ava said carefully. The current count is 184. Brielle gave her a sharp look. That count does not include vendor meals. Vendor meals are served in the staff dining room. My sister looked at Owen. This is exactly what Dana wanted. She came here to make me defend every decision on my wedding day. Owen did not raise his voice. I asked why invited guests were crossed off the list. They are employees. That is not an answer. Brielle paced toward the window. The system generated preliminary invitations from an old contact group. They were never supposed to be final. Ava glanced up. The confirmation emails required manual approval. Brielle stopped. She changed direction immediately. Then Dana must have approved them. Her administrator profile is still active. I watched Owen's face. A minute ago, the invitations were generated automatically. Now I approved them? I do not know what access you still have. You told everyone I had no access. You always knew ways around the system. Owen pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. Does Dana still have a password? No, Brielle said. Then, almost in the same breath, she added, not one we know about. The contradiction sat between us. Ava turned her tablet toward Owen. The invitation approvals came from the wedding planning account, not the hotel payroll account. Dana has never had access to this platform. Brielle's cheeks flushed. Then someone copied her contact group. Who? I do not know. Owen looked toward the open door, where the guests' voices had begun rising again. The ceremony is paused until we understand what is happening. Brielle stared at him. You cannot pause our wedding because Dana brought disgruntled employees here. I can pause my wedding. For the first time that day, my sister looked frightened rather than angry. My father's voice came through the ballroom speakers before any of us could respond. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention? Owen moved toward the door. Charles stood on the small stage beside the head table with a microphone in one hand. Diane had joined him. She held her hands together at her waist and wore the expression of a woman preparing to endure a private sorrow with public dignity. My father had not waited for us. We seemed to be experiencing an unfortunate family disruption, he told the room. I apologize to all of you, particularly to Owen's family. Guests turned toward the open waiting room door. Brielle hurried out. Owen followed at a slower pace. I stepped into the ballroom behind them. Charles continued, Many of you know that our older daughter, Dana, once managed the Whitaker Grand. 5 years ago, we discovered that she had been moving money through the payroll system without authorization. Rosa stood near the rear wall. Marcus was beside her. Neither moved. We chose not to pursue criminal charges, Charles said, because she was our daughter, and because we hoped time would bring healing. That was the first clean lie. My lawyer had forced them to withdraw the accusation after my bank records showed that none of the missing money had entered my accounts. They had not spared me. They had failed to prove theft. My mother touched his arm as if the memory hurt her. Charles looked directly at me. Today, Dana returned with former employees, private vehicles, confidential payroll documents, and accusations against the family that gave her every opportunity she ever had. A guest near the front whispered something to her husband. He looked at me with recognition. The old story had reached him years before I had. My father gestured toward the lobby. Now we find her administrator code on new payroll transactions. The ballroom tightened around me. He had arranged the facts in the most damaging order possible. The employees appeared first, then the records, then my code, then the old accusation. He did not need to prove the conclusion if every step made it feel inevitable. Owen walked toward the stage. Charles, stop. I am protecting your wedding. You are turning it into a public hearing. Dana already did that. No, I said. You did. My voice carried without the microphone. Charles looked almost pleased when I began walking toward him. I stopped below the stage. If we are going to discuss what happened 5 years ago, I said, then we discuss what I actually did. My mother's eyes narrowed. She knew I was not going to offer the clean denial she could dismiss as another lie. I used manual wage corrections, I told the room. Several employees shifted. A woman at one of the family tables covered her mouth. Charles held the microphone slightly toward me, inviting me to condemn myself. A manual wage correction allows an authorized manager to repair an error in an employee's pay. I continued. A missing shift, unpaid overtime, a distribution that was calculated incorrectly. You moved money without approval, Charles said. I had authority to correct individual payroll errors below a defined limit. You made repeated corrections. Yes. The single word changed the air. I heard Elijah breathe out behind me. I corrected multiple employees across several pay periods, I said. I did not prepare the consolidated report required by company policy. I did not notify the advisory board. I did not tell my father because I believed he would reverse the payments. Charles spoke into the microphone. There it is. There what is? You admit you concealed financial transactions. I concealed wage corrections from you. You concealed movement of company funds. I returned money employees had already earned. He pointed toward the guests. She decided that by herself. That part was true. I turned so I was no longer speaking only to him. No money went into my personal account. I did not buy a house, a car, or anything else with it. Every correction was attached to an employee, a time record, or a distribution the hotel's own policy said they should receive. Then why hide it? Someone asked from a nearby table. Because I thought I could protect the employees by solving the problem before my father knew they had complained. Elijah met my eyes from the back of the room. I was wrong, I said. I took away their ability to decide whether they wanted to fight openly, document what was happening, or walk away. I believed I knew the safest choice for everyone. Charles let the room absorb that admission. My honesty did not give me control. It gave the guests more complicated facts, and complicated facts were harder to love than a simple thief. A server passed through the side aisle carrying an empty tray. A wineglass tapped lightly against the silver edge. The sound pulled a piece of the past through me. A gray morning in October. The sharp smell of industrial cleaner from the service corridor. Rosa standing in my office with 2 sets of papers spread across the desk. Original timesheets on the left, pay stubs on the right. "These hours are gone," she had said. I had counted them twice. 12 hours missing from Maribel. 9 from Elijah. 7 from a dishwasher named Curtis. Service distributions delayed across 3 events. My father had stood in the doorway later that day, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. Temporary retention, he had called it. We will put everything back after the busy season. I had believed I could correct the immediate damage and confront the larger problem after the employees were paid. I had believed I had time. The ballroom returned around me when Charles stepped down from the stage. He handed the microphone to my mother and opened a leather document case resting beside the head table. "I hoped we would never need this again," he said. That was another performance. He had brought the case to a wedding. He removed a notarized statement and held it up before turning toward Rosa. "This affidavit was signed during the internal review 5 years ago." Rosa's shoulders stiffened. My father read from the document. "Dana Whitaker instructed me not to discuss payroll corrections with Charles Whitaker, Diane Whitaker, other employees, or outside parties. She stated that disclosure could cause the corrections to be reversed and could result in employees losing their positions." A low murmur spread across the room. The language sounded worse when separated from the fear surrounding it. Charles looked at me. "Did you tell Rosa to remain silent?" "I told her not to raise the issue with you until I secured the corrections." "So yes." "Yes. I told her to wait." He turned toward Rosa. "Is this your signature?" My mother walked to Rosa with the microphone. The employees parted enough to let her through. Rosa looked at the document for several seconds. I remembered her hand trembling when she placed her name tag in my palm. Now it remained steady at her side. "The signature is mine," she said. A few guests reacted immediately. Charles's shoulders loosened. Brielle closed her eyes as though the worst interruption had finally been contained. Rosa lifted her gaze to me, then to the people around her. "But the statement is not the whole truth." My mother stepped closer. Her public sorrow vanished from her face, leaving something flat and cold beneath it. "Then tell them," Diane said. "Tell them what Dana made you hide." "Tell them what Dana made you hide," my mother said. Rosa looked at the microphone Diane held in front of her, but when she spoke, her eyes stayed on me. "Dana told me not to confront Charles until the wage corrections cleared," she said. "That part is true." My father nodded as if the matter had already been settled. Rosa continued. "What the statement leaves out is what happened after Dana lost access to the payroll system. The ballroom disappeared behind a memory I had spent 5 years trying to contain. In September of 2020, I was 34 and working 12-hour days at the Whitaker Grand. My title was Director of Operations, but titles meant very little when the kitchen refrigeration failed 20 minutes before a banquet. A guest flooded a bathroom on the 3rd floor, and 2 housekeepers called in sick during a sold-out weekend. That morning, I moved a wedding breakfast into the lakeside dining room, found a temporary refrigeration truck, refunded one night to the guest with the flooded room, and helped housekeeping turn 6 rooms before check-in. The employees trusted me because I understood what their jobs required. My father tolerated that trust as long as I remembered the hotel belonged to him. Brielle worked in marketing and guest relations. She designed advertisements, handled charity events, and appeared in every photograph my mother sent to the local newspaper. She was good at making people feel welcome, but Charles rarely asked her opinion about operations. At lunch, he brought me into the office to discuss winter staffing while Brielle stood beside the door holding mock-ups for a new campaign. "I can come back later," she said. Charles barely looked at her. "Leave the samples with Diane." Brielle set the folder down. Her smile stayed in place, but she closed the door harder than necessary when she left. I noticed. I did not follow her. At the time, I thought competence spoke for itself. I did not understand that every time our father treated me as the serious daughter and Brielle as decoration, he gave her another reason to resent anything that carried my name. 2 weeks later, Rosa came into my office with a stack of timesheets under one arm and several pay stubs in her hand. "We have a problem," she said. The original time records showed 12 overtime hours missing from Maribel's check. Elijah's pay stub was short 9 hours. A banquet service distribution from a corporate event had never reached the employees, even though the event contract and our written payroll policy required that portion to be divided among the banquet staff. I checked another department, then another. The errors were too consistent to be random. I went to Charles with a list of affected employees and a preliminary total. He read the first page, placed it on his desk, and folded his hands. "It is temporary. You knew about this. We are retaining certain distributions until the end of the quarter. Those employees already earned the money, and they will receive it. When cash flow stabilizes." The hotel had lost several conferences that year. Vendor bills were rising, winter reservations were weak, and Charles had personally guaranteed part of the operating loan. He spoke as if those facts gave him the right to move money wherever he needed it. "You cannot use payroll as a line of credit," I said. "You cannot make payroll if the hotel closes. That is not the choice in front of us. It is the choice in front of me." He called the program temporary retention. He said the vendors would stop deliveries if they were not paid. He said the bank would tighten our line if we missed another target. He said every employee would be worse off if the hotel failed. "You protect payroll," he told me. "I protect the place that creates payroll." I asked to see the written policy authorizing the retention. He showed me a draft without complete signatures. That should have been the moment I went to the advisory board, documented every discrepancy, and allowed the employees to decide whether they wanted to file complaints. Instead, I decided I could correct the damage quietly. My administrator role allowed me to make manual wage corrections below a defined limit when an individual paycheck contained an error. I reviewed the original records, matched each correction to a specific employee and pay period, and restored what I could. I did not divide one large transaction to avoid approval. Each correction involved a separate employee or payroll error and fell within the authority I had been given. Technically, I knew how to repair the checks. What I did not do was prepare a consolidated report showing that the corrections formed a larger pattern. I did not notify the advisory board. I did not tell the employees that Charles had approved a retention program. Most importantly, I told Rosa not to confront him until the corrected payments cleared. "If he knows before the money reaches the accounts, he may reverse everything," I said. "You want us to stay quiet?" she asked. "For a few days. Do the others know?" "Not yet." Rosa studied me across the desk. "You are making this decision for them. I'm making sure they get paid." That was not my question. I should have listened. Instead, I told myself urgency justified control. I believed I could secure the money first and explain later. The system flagged the repeated corrections within days. Diane came into my office carrying printed transaction summaries. She closed the door behind her and placed the pages in front of me. "Your father is furious. The corrections are accurate. That is not the issue. It is exactly the issue." She sat across from me. "The hotel is under pressure. Your father made a temporary decision to protect everyone. He withheld earned wages. He moved funds. Those are not the same thing." My mother lowered her voice. "Paperwork can be corrected. Language can be softened. We can present this as an internal reconciliation instead of misconduct. You want me to rewrite the reports. I want you to protect the family. I will not create false records." Diane looked at me for several seconds. "You always need to be the one person in the room who is morally correct." "No, I need the pay records to be correct." Her expression changed then. The concern disappeared. "You have made a serious mistake, Dana." I corrected one. "You moved money without informing the owner. Under authority I was given. Authority can be withdrawn." It was withdrawn that afternoon. My key card stopped opening the administrative wing. My payroll password no longer worked. Security escorted me from the office while employees watched from the corridor. By the next morning, New transactions had appeared under my administrator profile, DW01. At the time, I only knew someone was still using my code after I had been locked out. I could not see the device history. I could not access the original files. My parents claimed I had created vendor payments and concealed them among the wage corrections. The later audit filled in parts I could not know then. Diane had asked the software provider to keep DW01 active for continuity and reconciliation. The workstation tied to several disputed entries was located in her office. The false vendor profiles were created after my access card had been canceled. Charles had signed the temporary retention policy. He also received reports with obvious gaps, and still accepted the version that made me the only wrongdoer. He never wrote that he knew I was innocent. He did not need to. His signature, his emails, and his refusal to investigate the missing pages showed what he had chosen to protect. The employees did not respond as one group. Rosa was called into Diane's office. Her husband was receiving cancer treatment through insurance tied to Rosa's employment. Diane reminded her that if the housekeeping department was restructured, Rosa might lose the employer contribution and be forced to cover the full premium while risking a change in the medical network. Rosa could have continued coverage at her own expense. Diane knew the cost was beyond what she could manage. She put the affidavit in front of Rosa and told her that signing it would keep the department stable. Marcus saw Diane using the old computer in my office after hours. He refused to sign a statement against me. 3 days later, he was accused of taking a watch from a guest's room and fired. The watch was later found in the guest's luggage. By then, Marcus's name had already been damaged. Maribel believed the transaction summaries Diane showed her. They made it appear that I had mixed legitimate payroll corrections with payments to fake vendors. Elijah suspected the story was false. But he had 2 children and no savings. He stayed silent because he could not risk joining Marcus in the unemployment line. Other employees knew only that I had been escorted from the building and that my administrator code appeared on disputed transactions. Before I could call a meeting or explain what had happened, I no longer had access to the property. I hired a lawyer. My bank records proved no hotel money had entered my personal accounts. There was no luxury purchase, no hidden transfer, and no financial benefit to me. Without that connection, my parents could not turn their internal accusation into a credible criminal case. But being difficult to prosecute was not the same as being cleared. The detailed device logs had not been preserved. The original vendor files remained inside the hotel. Rosa had signed the affidavit. Marcus had no recording of what he saw. Most employees refused to speak. My lawyer helped me challenge the termination and stop my parents from publicly calling the matter proven theft. She could not make them admit they had framed me. I left Lake Mercer. I changed my number, moved to Madison, and cut off nearly everyone connected to the hotel. I told myself my absence would protect the employees. If they could honestly say they had no contact with me, Charles and Diane would have less reason to punish them. The truth was less noble. I was humiliated, furious, and unable to bear hearing another person say they wished they could help, but could not risk it. Marcus sent 2 messages through mutual contacts. I did not answer either one. After the second attempt, he stopped trying. Within months, Brielle moved into the office I had used. My parents announced that she had stepped forward when the family needed her most. My silence gave Diane what she wanted. For nearly 5 years, she controlled every version of the story. Rosa's voice brought me back to the ballroom. Dana told me to wait because she believed Charles would reverse the wage corrections, she said. After Dana was locked out, Diane called me into her office. My mother's hand tightened around the microphone. She said my department could be eliminated, Rosa continued. She reminded me what losing the hotel's insurance contribution would cost while my husband was in treatment. Then she gave me the statement. That is a lie, Diane said. Rosa reached into her purse and removed her phone. I saved the voicemail. My mother stared at it. Rosa did not play the recording for the ballroom. She handed the phone to Marcus, who placed it in an evidence envelope he had brought with him. This is not entertainment, Rosa said. It will go to the lawyers. The room remained divided. Rosa had confirmed that Diane pressured her, but she had also confirmed that I asked employees to remain silent. Both things were true. Brielle appeared beside me and closed her fingers around my wrist. We need to talk, she whispered. I pulled my arm free, but I followed her into the bridal dressing room because the fear in her face was new. She shut the door behind us. Outside, the guests' voices rose again. Inside, Brielle stood beside a mirror framed by white flowers, breathing as if the dress had become too tight around her ribs. I can clear your name tonight, she said. I waited. All you have to do is say Dad acted alone. I studied her reflection in the mirror. How can you clear my name, I asked, if you never knew what happened? Brielle looked toward the closed door. For several seconds, she said nothing. Brielle looked toward the closed door and lowered her voice. Dad approved the retention plan, she said. He decided the hotel could hold the money. I did not. You just offered to clear my name if I blamed him alone. Because he started it. That is not the same as acting alone. She crossed her arms over the bodice of her dress. I received an event budget. I used it. I did not sit in payroll and move money. Did you know where the budget came from? No. The answer came too quickly. I looked at her reflection in the mirror. Then how do you know there is a report that can clear me? Brielle's lips parted, but no words followed. You did not say there might be a report, I continued. You said you could give it to me. It is an old internal review. Where is it? I can get it. Where has it been for 5 years? Her eyes moved toward the flowers on the vanity. That is not important right now. It is the only thing that matters right now. Outside the dressing room, a chair scraped across the ballroom floor. The quartet had stopped playing. The quiet made every word between us feel louder. Brielle stepped closer. If you tell the guests Dad acted alone, I will give you the report tonight. You can take it to your lawyer, clear your name, and walk away from this place for good. What happens to Mom? She did what Dad told her. And you? I planned a wedding, with money taken from employees. I did not know that. You knew enough to remove 32 people from the guest list. They were going to confront us. About something you claim you knew nothing about. She looked away. For one brief moment, the offer tempted me. 5 years of suspicion could end with one file. I could take the report, let Charles carry the blame, and leave before another guest looked at me as if I had entered the ballroom to steal something. It would have been easy. It would also have repeated everything my family had done. Choose one person, put every sin on that person, call the story complete. Give me the report without conditions, I said. Brielle shook her head. You still do not understand how this family survives. I understand exactly how it survives. By destroying everything? By deciding which person can be sacrificed. Her face tightened. You would rather ruin my wedding than win in a way that is practical. A practical lie is still a lie. You always have to be righteous. No, I have to know why you had evidence that could clear me and chose not to use it. She reached for the door. I am done talking to you. I moved aside. Bring me the report. Brielle opened the door and looked back at me. Help me contain this, and I will. Then she walked out. I stayed in the dressing room long enough to steady my breathing. The offer had not failed because it was weak. It had failed because part of me wanted it. When I returned to the lobby, the employees had divided into 2 groups. Rosa, Marcus, Tessa, and several former employees stood near the staircase. Closer to the main doors, a dozen current workers spoke in low voices about leaving before Charles started firing people. Elijah noticed me first. So what now, he asked. Do we put the records out or not? That is your decision. He frowned. You said not to show them. I said not to display everyone's private information without permission. If you want to share your own pay stub, you can. If you want to leave, you can. No one here has to risk a job to prove loyalty to me. A banquet server near him looked toward the ballroom. What if they fire us anyway? Save copies of your own records. Do not take files you are not authorized to access. Do not argue with guests. If Charles tells you to leave, document the instruction and leave peacefully. You are telling us to walk away? Elijah asked. I am telling you not to give him a reason to turn this into trespassing or misconduct. Rosa studied me. That is different from 5 years ago. I am trying. The employees began making their own choices. 4 decided to leave after giving Marcus their contact information. Others stayed. No one was pressured to speak. Tessa waited until the group thinned before approaching me. I sent the report, she said. Marcus glanced toward the ballroom doors. The anonymous one? She nodded. You did not have to tell us that here, I said. I did not want you thinking someone had full access to everything. I only see payroll summaries. I cannot see the bank accounts or vendor transfers. What made you send it? Brielle asked me to export deductions by code and employee name. She said the numbers were for an internal staffing analysis. The codes on the guest list? Yes, U, M, T, S, and OT. Did she ask you to put them into the wedding file? No, I exported the report. A week later, I saw the same codes in the seating spreadsheet when she asked me to verify employee names. Could someone else have imported them? Yes. Tessa's honesty mattered more than certainty. Do you have the original email requesting the export? In my work account. Do not forward it to me. Preserve it. Write down when you received it and what you were asked to do. She looked relieved that I had not asked her to steal anything. Ava Chen stood near the ballroom entrance with her tablet pressed against her side. She had spent the afternoon trying to keep a wedding running while my family turned every room into a battlefield. I approached her with Tessa and Marcus. Ava, I need to ask about the planning file. Her expression became guarded. I cannot give you client materials. I am not asking you to. That got her attention. Does the file have version history? Yes, it is stored under my company's event account. Can Brielle delete the older versions? She can edit the live file, but she cannot permanently remove the audit history without my administrator access. Has she asked you to hide columns? Ava hesitated, then answered carefully. She asked me to hide several operational fields before printing the guest list. That is common when a working document contains internal notes. Did she ask what the hidden fields contained? She created most of them. Tessa looked at me. Please lock the file against further edits, I said. Do not send me a copy. Do not give me a password. Preserve it until the party's lawyers decide what happens next. Ava looked toward Owen, who was speaking to his parents across the lobby. I need authorization from a client. Owen is also your client. Before she could respond, he came toward us. His face had changed since the conversation in the waiting room. The shock had given way to concentration. I just heard Brielle ask Ava's assistant to delete the older versions, he said. Ava turned sharply toward him. When? 2 minutes ago near the service hall. The assistant refused and told her only you could do it. Brielle appeared behind him. I asked her to remove outdated guest data. Owen faced her. You ask her to delete the version history. There is private information in that file. Then why delete it instead of preserve it? Because Dana is trying to turn every wedding document into evidence. I am asking Ava to preserve it, I said. I have not asked to take it. Brielle looked at Ava. You work for us. I work for both named clients on the contract, Ava replied. And my professional obligation is to preserve a disputed file once I know its contents may be relevant. My sister's eyes flashed. Nothing in that file is disputed. Owen stared at her. You have given me 3 explanations for the money today. First, the employee invitations were automatic. Then they were removed because of space. Now the deductions are part of an event budget you never questioned. I am under pressure. So am I. She reached for his hand. He stepped back. The vows are not starting until I understand what was done, he said. Brielle's face went pale. You cannot humiliate me in front of everyone. I am not the person who created the situation. Ava unlocked her tablet. As co-client, Owen can review the working file, she said. I can display a read-only historical version here. No one will download it, copy credentials, or change the source. We moved into the smaller conference room beside the ballroom. Ava closed the outer door but left the inner glass panel uncovered. Owen, Brielle, Tessa, and I stood around the table while Marcus remained outside as a witness to who entered. Ava selected a version saved 11 days earlier. The seating chart appeared first. She expanded the hidden columns. The codes were there. U, M, T, S, OT. Beside them were dollar amounts and wedding categories. Uniform adjustments aligned with bridal alterations and accessory deposits. Meal deductions aligned with the tasting dinner. Training adjustments aligned with the floral deposit. Service distributions aligned with champagne and bar upgrades. Overtime adjustments were grouped beside entertainment and transportation costs. The file did not prove every transfer had reached a vendor. It proved someone had deliberately connected employee deductions to wedding expenses. Owen read the columns twice. Brielle? She stared at the screen. Those were budgeting references. References to whose money? I was told those amounts were available. By whom? My parents. Which parent? She did not answer. Ava opened the changelog. Tessa pointed toward a field labeled Source Administrator. 21. My old profile code. The timestamps beside several uploads were less than a month old. Owen looked at me. This was uploaded last month, he said. Tell me why your name is on it. Before I could answer, the conference room door opened. My mother stood there. Her gaze moved from the screen to me. Because she never left our system, my mother said. Diane stood in the conference room doorway, as though she had arrived to correct a minor misunderstanding. Her blue dress remained smooth, her makeup untouched, and her voice carried the calm authority she had used for years whenever she wanted other people to accept her version of events before asking questions. I looked at the code on Ava's screen. DW01 was not an account I could carry away with me, I said. It was an administrator profile installed on the hotel's internal payroll workstation. My mother folded her arms. It was your profile. Yes, while I worked here. You knew the password. 5 years ago. Owen looked between us. Could Dana access it from Madison? Not through the version we used when I managed operations, I said. It was not a cloud login. The profile had to be opened from an authorized machine connected to the hotel's internal network. Brielle seized on the qualification. You said the version you used. The software may have changed. It may have, I said. That is why I'm not claiming I know who entered these records. Charles entered behind Diane. He had followed her from the ballroom, bringing the leather document case with him. You seem comfortable making every other accusation, he said. I am comfortable saying what the evidence shows. The file contains my old profile code. It does not identify the person who used the machine. You expect us to believe someone kept your credentials active for 5 years? I expect the software provider to answer that. I took out my phone and called my lawyer. When she answered, I summarized only what we had confirmed. The wedding file contained recent payroll data under DW01. The profile had once belonged to me, and the source system was controlled by the hotel. I need the preservation letter expanded, I told her. Include vendor support tickets, account retention requests, workstation serial numbers, login policies, network access records, and any available logs connected to DW01. My mother laughed quietly. You think listing technical terms makes this less obvious? No, it makes it testable. Ava looked at the read-only file. The platform records who entered the notes in this spreadsheet. It does not verify who generated the source payroll export. Then we keep those questions separate, I said. Tessa nodded. That is how the systems work. The simple agreement from an employee weakened my mother's performance more than an argument would have. She looked at Tessa as if she had forgotten the young woman was still in the room. Owen turned back to the screen. Show me the earlier version again. Ava opened the hidden columns. The categories appeared beside employee deductions and wedding expenses. The first entries looked like ordinary internal codes. When the file widened, the meaning became clearer. Uniform adjustments had been placed beside bridal alterations, accessories, and garment storage. Meal deductions appeared beside the rehearsal dinner and tasting costs. Training adjustments matched the florist deposit and part of the band's fee. A column labeled service distribution was divided between champagne upgrades, premium liquor, and decorative glassware. Those distributions were not generic hotel revenue. The written banquet policy promised that portion to employees who worked the events. Overtime adjustments had been assigned to guest suites, transportation, and entertainment. Brielle had entered notes beside several lines. Recover after summer events. Replace from new bookings. Temporary internal bridge. Owen read them aloud. My sister stood beside the table with both hands pressed against the edge. Those were reminders. Reminders to do what? He asked. To restore the funds. The room became still. Charles moved first. That is standard cash flow management. I turned toward him. You said the same thing in 2020. Because it remains true. Businesses move money between obligations. Employees are not lenders. No one said they were. You withheld money they had already earned and planned to replace it if future business was strong enough. He pointed toward the screen. Nothing here proves anyone intended permanent loss. Owen stared at him. You are defending this? I'm explaining it. You took money from hourly employees to pay for champagne. Charles's jaw tightened. The wedding was also a commercial showcase. We invited planners, corporate clients, and regional tourism partners. The bookings generated by this event would have benefited the hotel and everyone working here. Elijah had entered the conference room behind Marcus. He had heard enough. My landlord does not accept future bookings, he said. Charles turned. This meeting is private. My paycheck was not private when you used it for the bar. Brielle looked at Owen. I was going to pay everything back after the summer season. He studied her face. You knew. I knew the hotel was bridging funds. You knew those funds came from employee pay. I knew they were temporary adjustments. That is not what I asked. She closed her eyes for a moment. Yes, I knew some of it came from payroll. The admission did not produce a dramatic reaction. No one shouted. The truth simply removed the last place she had been hiding. Owen stepped away from the table. How much? I do not know the final number. Ava's file shows $94,000 connected to wedding categories. Not all of that was spent. How much was? I would have to check. You built the budget. I was handling hundreds of details. You labeled the source of each line. Her voice sharpened. Because I needed to track what had to be replaced. He looked at the white dress, the flowers, and the file between them. You built our wedding with money people never agreed to lend you. It was supposed to bring business back. That is your father's argument. Brielle turned toward Charles, perhaps expecting him to distinguish her actions from his. Instead, he nodded. She made an aggressive decision under pressure, he said. That is leadership. Dana, from 5 years earlier, might have enjoyed seeing Brielle finally understand what his approval meant. He was not defending her because she was his chosen daughter. He was defending the method because condemning it would condemn himself. I felt no satisfaction. My sister looked as though someone had removed the floor beneath an identity she had spent years building. Tessa spoke from near the door. There may be a support ticket. Everyone turned toward her. She rubbed her thumb along the edge of her folder. About DW01. What ticket? I asked. A few months after I started, I helped digitize old payroll correspondence. There was an email from the software vendor asking whether inactive administrator profiles should be removed during an update. When was that? I do not remember the exact date. The ticket was old. Did it name DW01? I think so. The reply said the profile had to remain for continuity and reconciliation. My mother responded before anyone asked another question. That email proves nothing. Tessa looked at her. I did not say what the email proved. Diane's expression did not change, but the room had heard the mistake. I kept my voice neutral. Who replied to the vendor? I only saw the printed ticket briefly. I remember the sender initials were DW. Charles gave a dismissive sound. Dana Whitaker. No, Tessa said. The reply was sent from the executive office address. My mother stepped forward. Do you understand how many messages pass through that office? Staff members drafted responses for all of us. That may be true, I said. The provider's copy will show the address, timestamps, attachments, and the workstation serial referenced in the ticket. You are treating an ordinary maintenance request as a confession. No one called it a confession. Again, she had tried to defeat a conclusion before I made it. I spoke into my phone, where my lawyer had remained on the line. Add the historical vendor ticket and the executive office mailbox to the preservation request. Diane looked at Charles. He did not look back. For the first time that day, she seemed to understand that his instinct for survival might not include protecting her. She walked to a side cabinet in the conference room and opened the leather document case Charles had carried inside. From it, she removed a printed memorandum. If we are preserving documents, she said, then this should be included. Brielle frowned. What is that? A record of concerns I raised before the wedding. My mother placed the memorandum on the table. The heading read Internal Event Budget Irregularities. The document stated that Brielle had exceeded her approved wedding budget, requested access to restricted payroll summaries, and made unauthorized decisions while under severe personal pressure. It described Charles and Diane as owners who relied on information supplied by their younger daughter and had no knowledge that employee deductions were being associated with wedding costs. Near the end, one paragraph recommended suspending Brielle's financial authority if irregularities were discovered. Owen read the date. The memorandum had been created 5 weeks before the wedding. Brielle's face emptied. "You wrote this before I finished the budget. I documented concerns. You approved every vendor. I approved a total amount based on information you provided. You told me to make the wedding impossible to ignore. That did not authorize misconduct." Brielle picked up the memorandum. Her fingers shook hard enough to move the paper. "You knew exactly what I was doing. I knew you were under stress. You gave me the payroll export." My mother's voice remained level. "Be careful. You said we would replace the money after the summer contracts. Your recollection is unreliable." Charles moved toward them. "This conversation needs to stop." Brielle looked at him. "Did you know she wrote this?" He did not answer. That silence told her enough. The memorandum was not a response to the scandal. It was a shield prepared before the first guest arrived. Diane had allowed Brielle to build the wedding, encouraged her to use the hotel's future as justification, and created a document that could isolate her if the plan failed. My mother had not chosen Brielle over me 5 years earlier because she loved her more. She had chosen whichever daughter was easier to use. Owen took the memorandum from Brielle and handed it to Ava. "Preserve this with the event file." Diane reached for it. "That is a private ownership document." Ava did not give it back. It was presented during a disputed financial review in front of multiple witnesses. "I will preserve the copy and let counsel determine access." My mother stared at her, as if service professionals were not supposed to have boundaries. Owen left the conference room. We followed him into the ballroom. Most guests were still there, seated or standing in anxious groups. The officiant waited near the floral arch, speaking quietly with Owen's parents. Owen walked to the stage and took the microphone. Brielle stopped a few feet behind him. "I am sorry to everyone who came here expecting a wedding," he said. "There will be no vows tonight." A wave of whispers moved through the room. Brielle grabbed his arm. "Do not do this." He lowered the microphone. "I am not signing a marriage license while I am still learning what was done in both our names. You are ending everything because Dana appeared with a spreadsheet? I am stopping a ceremony because you admitted using employee wages and tried to delete the record. I said I would repay it. That does not make it yours to take." The officiant approached. Owen asked him not to complete or file any marriage documents. The license remained unsigned. There was no marriage to dissolve, only a ceremony that would not happen. Brielle looked toward the guests. "Owen, please. We can discuss this privately." "We have been discussing it privately. Your answers keep changing." He did not announce that he hated her or that their relationship was permanently over. He told her to contact her own lawyer, preserve her phone and files, and stop making statements until she had advice independent from her parents. Then he walked toward his family. The ballroom began to empty. Some guests left quietly. Others paused to speak to Owen or his parents. A few relatives approached Diane, but she repeated that the situation was an internal misunderstanding and asked everyone not to spread incomplete information. No one returned to the tables. The banquet staff stopped serving. Maribel placed her tray on the service station. Elijah removed his kitchen apron and folded it across a chair. Other workers followed them, not in protest, but because the event they had been ordered to serve no longer existed. The untouched champagne remained in silver buckets. My mother stood near the head table, watching the room she had designed for photographs dissolve into scattered chairs and unfinished conversations. "This can still be contained," she said. Brielle turned toward her. Her veil had slipped to one side. Mascara had darkened beneath one eye, and the polished expression she wore in every family advertisement was gone. "Contained?" she asked. Diane lowered her voice. "You need to stop talking. We will manage the documents and issue a statement tomorrow." "You mean you will use the memorandum?" "It records what happened. It records what you plan to say happened." Charles stepped between them. "Brielle, enough." She looked at him, then at the paper Ava had preserved. "You were both going to put this on me." "No one is putting anything on you," Diane said. "Your own entries are in the file. You told me to use them. Do not make accusations you cannot support." Brielle gave a broken laugh. That is what you said about Dana. Charles's face hardened. Be quiet. My sister looked past him at me. There was no triumph in her expression now. Only terror, and something that had waited too long to become shame. You cannot blame me for all of it, she told our mother. You used the same method before. Diane went still. Charles reached for Brielle's elbow. Not another word. She pulled away from him. There was a report, she said. I did not move. Brielle's voice shook, but it carried across the nearly empty ballroom. I found the access report 5 years ago. It proved Dana was not the one at that computer. The remaining conversations stopped. I looked at my sister. How long did you keep it? Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. Until tonight, Brielle said. The words settled over the ballroom more heavily than the silence that followed them. My sister had kept evidence that could have changed the last 5 years of my life. She had watched our parents turn me into a thief, moved into my office, accepted the title they once promised me, and built a public identity around the story that I had abandoned the family. All that time, she had known there was a report. Where is it? I asked. Brielle looked toward our mother. Diane stood near the head table, her posture perfectly straight. It is an incomplete technical document. It does not prove what Brielle thinks it proves. I did not ask you. My mother's mouth tightened. I kept my attention on Brielle. Where is the report? In the old records room. Inside the box you promised to give me? She nodded. The box had not been an attempt at reconciliation. It had been leverage. Brielle had invited me to the wedding with the promise of evidence she had already decided to exchange for my cooperation. Get it, I said. My father stepped between us. No one is removing company records from this property. Brielle turned on him. It is already in a box with her name on it. That does not make it hers. It is about her. Charles looked toward the few guests who remained in the ballroom. Most had moved closer to the exits, but they were still listening. This discussion is over, he said. No, Owen replied from beside his parents. The ceremony is over. The discussion is not. Brielle lifted the front of her dress and walked toward the service corridor. I followed her, but I stopped when she reached a locked door beside the accounting office. Key, I said. She pulled a small ring from beneath the ribbon around her wrist. Our mother had often praised Brielle for always being prepared. That night, the keys revealed what she had prepared for. She unlocked the records room. The air inside smelled of cardboard, dust, and old carpet. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Boxes from past wedding seasons were stacked beneath a narrow window. On a metal shelf near the back sat a gray archival box with my name written across the lid. The handwriting was Brielle's. She lifted it down and placed it on a table. I did not open it immediately. When did you find the report? I asked. A few weeks after you left. Before or after you moved into my office? Her eyes lowered. Before. The answer hurt more than I expected. She had known before she sat behind my desk. Before our parents introduced her as the daughter who had saved the hotel. Before she gave interviews about rebuilding trust after an internal financial betrayal. What did it say? It listed access activity connected to DW01. There were timestamps after your keycard had been canceled. It also listed a workstation serial number. Which workstation? The one in Mom's office. Diane had maintained a small executive office beside accounting. She claimed she used it for charity records, employee celebrations, and correspondence. It was also the room where Rosa had been pressured to sign the affidavit. Did the report identify the person sitting at the computer? I asked. No. Did it include login credentials? It showed the administrator profile, the workstation serial, the dates, and some system activity. The final page was missing. What was supposed to be on the final page? Metadata notes, device mapping, maybe the user session details. I do not know. So, the report did not prove Mom created the fake vendors. No, but it proved activity under my profile continued from a computer in her office after my access was revoked. Brielle nodded. Why did you hide it? She turned toward the stacked boxes. I had just spent my whole life being told you were the one who understood the business. Dad took you to lender meetings, employees went to you with problems. Even when I created campaigns that filled rooms, he called it decoration. None of that was new to me. Hearing it did not excuse what followed. After you left, she continued, Dad started asking for my opinion. Mom said I was the only one holding the family together. For the first time, they treated me as if I mattered. And the report threatened that. It threatened everything. It threatened a lie. It threatened the hotel. No, Brielle, it threatened your position inside it. She turned back to me. You do not know what it was like being compared to you. I know what it was like being framed while you kept the document that could have challenged them. Mom told me the report was inconclusive. She said releasing it would create another investigation, scare the lender, and cost people their jobs. And you believed her? I wanted to. That was the closest she came to the full truth. She had been manipulated, but manipulation worked because it offered her something she wanted. Our parents gave her status, approval, and the future she believed I had taken from her. She accepted their explanation because rejecting it would have required giving those things up. You had 5 years to reconsider, I said. I know. You watched them repeat the story. I know. You invited me here planning to trade the report for my silence. Her eyes filled. I thought I could fix both things. You thought you could keep your wedding, keep your position, and give me just enough truth to make me leave quietly. She did not deny it. I opened the box. Inside were payroll summaries, old advisory board notes, printed emails, copies of vendor sheets, and the access report folded inside a blue file. The final page ended halfway through a table. The page number in the corner showed there should have been one more. I photographed the contents without removing anything. Then I called my lawyer and described what Brielle had given me. She instructed me not to take the originals until ownership and custody were documented. Ava brought a tamper evidence storage bag from her event office, and Brielle signed a short statement confirming that she had maintained the box and voluntarily produced it. My parents refused to sign as witnesses. Marcus did. When we returned to the lobby, only a few family members remained. The employees had gathered near the front entrance. No one was touching the food or clearing the tables. Marcus stood beside the staircase while Ava secured the wedding planning file. I showed him a photograph of the workstation serial number. He recognized it immediately. That was the machine in Diane's office, he said. You are certain? I carried it there when accounting replaced the front office computer. It had a dent near the lower vent. What did you see 5 years ago? He glanced toward my parents before answering. 3 nights after your card stopped working, I came back for my jacket. The executive office light was on. Diane was sitting at that computer with transaction sheets beside her. Did you see what she entered? No. I saw the payroll screen and your profile name at the top, I told Charles the next morning. My father looked away. What did he say? I asked. He said Diane was reconciling the mess you left behind. And the watch? Marcus's expression hardened. The following day, management accused me of taking a guest's watch. Security searched my locker. They fired me before the guest called to say the watch was inside his own suitcase. Charles interrupted. You were terminated for multiple policy violations. Name them. This is not the time. It was the time when you needed me gone. Marcus looked back at me. I tried to contact you through 2 people. When you did not answer, I decided you wanted nothing to do with any of us. I changed my number. I know that now. I told myself disappearing would protect you. It protected them. The sentence was not cruel. That made it harder to reject. You should have tried again, I said, then immediately heard the unfairness in it. Marcus held my gaze. Maybe I should have. I exhaled slowly. I made sure no one could reach me. That part belongs to me. He gave a small nod. It was not forgiveness. It was an agreement not to simplify the past. Rosa approached with her phone and an old printed email. The voicemail is attached here, she said. Marcus helped me send it to an account Diane did not know about. She opened the file but did not press play until I agreed. My mother's recorded voice filled the space between us. Rosa, I need the signed statement before Friday. I cannot guarantee that housekeeping will remain intact if this becomes a wider issue. You understand what restructuring would mean for your position, your employer contribution, and your husband's treatment network. I hope you will make the responsible choice. The recording ended. Diane's threat was careful. She had not said Rosa would immediately lose all medical coverage. She had reminded a frightened woman that keeping the job was the only affordable way to maintain the insurance contribution and medical network her husband relied on. Rosa locked the phone. "I signed the next morning," she said. "I knew the statement would hurt you. You were protecting your husband." "Yes, that explains it. It does not make it harmless." "I know." She did not ask me to understand more than I already did. She did not reach for my hand or tell me fear had removed her responsibility. "I am not asking you to erase it," she said. "I am asking for the chance to tell the truth now. Truth does not rebuild trust by itself." "No, it gives me somewhere to start." I handed her brass name tag back to her. "Keep it until we know what happens next." She closed her fingers around it. "Then I will." By 9:30, the ballroom had become an expensive room full of abandoned tables. Owen's parents had taken him to a nearby hotel. His lawyer had instructed him to preserve every message, contract, and file connected to the wedding. He did not follow me or offer to join our fight. That was the right decision. This was not his revenge story. Ava locked the planning account against edits and exported a preservation copy into her company's secure archive. Tessa wrote down the devices and files she had used for payroll work but did not remove anything from the accounting office. Marcus collected contact details from employees who wanted independent legal advice. Several employees wanted to post photographs of the pay stubs and wedding spreadsheet that night. I asked them to wait. "This does not belong to me alone," I told them. "Anyone can share their own experience. Do not post someone else's pay information. Do not edit screenshots. Do not make claims we cannot yet trace." Elijah crossed his arms. "You are worried about protecting the hotel?" "I am worried about protecting the case." He studied me before nodding. My father stood near the ballroom doors with the leather case under his arm. "You think lawyers will turn this performance into proof?" he asked. "No, that is why I am finished performing." "You brought 32 employees in limousines." "I brought invited people to the door you tried to close." "You wanted an audience." "I did. That was my mistake." The admission unsettled him. I had arrived expecting the guest list and payroll report to force the truth into the open. I had underestimated how easily he could use my old procedural violation against me. If I kept arguing in the ballroom, he would continue turning every uncertainty into another version of my guilt. I faced the remaining guests. "You were invited to a wedding, not asked to serve as jurors," I said. "The records will be preserved. The employees will decide for themselves whether to file claims. Nothing else needs to be decided in this room tonight." Diane stepped forward. "Dana, if you leave now, people will assume you cannot answer the accusations." I answered them. I corrected wages. I concealed the larger pattern. I was wrong to make that choice alone. I did not create fake vendors or take hotel money. "You cannot prove that. Not tonight." Her expression softened with relief before she could hide it. That was when I knew leaving was the stronger choice. The employees moved toward the main entrance. No one collected the champagne glasses. No one folded the linens or carried floral arrangements into storage. The staff members who remained on shift clocked out after documenting that management had suspended the event. Maribel passed beneath the Family Employer of the Year plaque without looking up. Elijah held the door for Eddie and his cane. Tessa walked between Rosa and Marcus, carrying no hotel files, only her purse and a written list of the records she intended to preserve. I stepped outside with them. Behind us, my parents remained beneath the chandeliers. Brielle stood near the head table in her wedding dress, surrounded by flowers paid for with money the employees had not agreed to lend her. The front doors closed without anyone touching the service entrance. The next morning, my lawyer called while I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my Madison apartment. The box Brielle had produced was secured in counsel's evidence storage. Ava's current file history was safe. The payroll provider had acknowledged the preservation request. Then my lawyer's voice changed. "The provider still has detailed logs for the current transactions," she said. "The historical retention cycle is the problem." "How much did they keep?" "Summary reports, support tickets, workstation references, and some account-level activity." "What about the user session logs from 2020? There was a pause. "The current records are safe. The user-level logs from nearly 5 years ago were purged 18 months ago." I looked at the photograph of the incomplete access report on my laptop. The workstation serial was there, the timestamps were there, my disabled access date was there. The final metadata page was not. We had enough to investigate the money taken for Brielle's wedding. We had enough to challenge the current use of DW01. But the strongest technical record that might have shown who created the transactions that destroyed my name no longer existed. My family had lost the wedding. They might still keep the lie. The morning after Brielle's wedding, nothing dramatic happened. No police cars arrived at the Whitaker Grand. No judge froze my parents' accounts. No government agent walked through the lobby carrying boxes. Charles opened the hotel on time. The front desk answered calls. Housekeepers cleaned the rooms. The kitchen served breakfast to guests who had slept through most of the disaster downstairs. Employees who needed their paychecks returned to work beside managers they no longer trusted. Reality did not care that the truth had finally entered the ballroom. It still needed documents, witnesses, dates, and time. My lawyer sent preservation notices to the hotel, the payroll provider, Ava's event company, the bank, and the wedding vendors on the next business day. The letters covered account records, emails, employee files, software tickets, workstation information, contracts, and every version of the wedding spreadsheet. The employees made their own decisions. Some wanted to file immediately. Others were afraid Charles would cut their hours before any protection took effect. A few refused to attach their names to anything until they understood whether the hotel might close. I did not tell them what courage was supposed to look like. An attorney representing the employee group met with them in a rented community room away from the hotel. She explained which claims could still be pursued and which older losses might no longer be recoverable as wages. The date mattered. The wedding had taken place on June 14, 2025. For the state wage claims, counsel focused on money that had come due during the 2 years immediately before the complaints. That meant the current claims did not begin in 2020. The records from the year I was fired could help show a pattern. They could support my defamation claim and demonstrate how false vendor entries had been used against me. They could not simply be added to the employee's present wage total as if no time had passed. That distinction disappointed people. It also kept the case honest. By the end of June, 71 current and former employees had authorized counsel to review their pay records. Not all of them filed the same claims. Some were missing overtime. Some had uniform or meal deductions they had never approved. Some were owed distributions from banquet service charges that the hotel's own written policy promised would be paid to the staff who worked those events. Voluntary tips were tracked separately. No one called every service charge a tip just because the word sounded similar. The written contracts, payroll policy, and pay records determined what the employees had been promised. Charles responded through counsel that the hotel had experienced administrative errors during a period of financial strain. He blamed software changes, individual managers, vendor confusion, and what he called unauthorized conduct by 2 daughters acting independently. He did not name which daughter had supposedly done what. My parents were still searching for a version of events that could leave both of them standing. The first forensic accounting meeting took place 6 weeks after the wedding. I sat across from the auditors with my attorney, the employee group's counsel, Rosa, and 2 payroll representatives. Ava joined by video and explained how the wedding file had been created, edited, and preserved. The auditors did not begin with accusations. They began with columns: employee name, pay period, time card hours, gross wages, deductions, service distribution, bank account, vendor invoice, wedding expense. They traced each line until a pattern emerged. Between January and June of 2025, 67 employees had lost a combined $94,000 through unauthorized or unsupported adjustments that were then associated with Brielle's wedding costs. The money had not moved through one obvious transfer labeled wedding. It traveled in smaller pieces. A group of training adjustments entered the hotel's operating account. Days later, a matching amount paid the florist's deposit. Meal deductions and retained service distributions were combined with regular revenue before the rehearsal dinner and bar invoices were paid. Overtime corrections disappeared into operating cash, which then covered entertainment, transportation, and guest suites. The accounting trail did not allow my family to point at $1 and say it bought 1 glass of champagne. It showed that money owed to employees was withheld, pooled, and used to support obligations the hotel would otherwise have lacked the cash to pay. The wedding spreadsheet proved Brielle knew those sources were being tracked. The The bank records proved the hotel used them. The larger review reached farther back. From June 17, 2023, through the wedding date, 71 employees had a combined $418,000 in unpaid wages, unsupported deductions, and promised service distributions still within the relevant claim period. The losses from 2020 were kept in a separate file. That file was about me. The payroll provider confirmed what my lawyer had already warned me about. Detailed user session logs from nearly 5 years earlier had been purged under the company's retention policy. No hidden server suddenly produced the missing final page from Brielle's report. No technician recovered a perfect record, naming the person who created every false entry. For several days, I believed the absence of that log would let my parents preserve one part of their lie. Then the provider found the support tickets. One ticket listed the serial number of the workstation associated with DW01. The installation record placed that workstation in Diane Whitaker's executive office. Another ticket had been opened after I was fired. The software provider recommended disabling administrator profiles belonging to separated employees. The response came from my mother's executive office email. Do not disable DW01. Profile required for continuity and reconciliation of open payroll matters. Diane later claimed an assistant might have written the message. The provider's file showed the request had been confirmed during a support call from the hotel's main office line. The notes did not identify the voice. They did prove the decision was deliberate. The system used at the time did not permit remote administrator access. The profile could only be opened from an authorized workstation connected to the hotel network. My badge records showed I had been locked out of the building. 2 of the false vendor transactions were created after I had started my new job in Madison. My time card placed me in my employer's office. A hotel receipt from an overnight work trip placed me in Green Bay for the second transaction. My company phone records showed calls with clients during both periods. None of those facts named the person sitting at Diane's computer. Together, they made it impossible to claim I had entered the transactions myself. Marcus gave a sworn statement about seeing Diane at the workstation after my access was revoked. Rosa authenticated the voicemail, pressuring her to sign the affidavit. Brielle confirmed she had found the access report and hidden it. The auditors also traced 2 fake vendors. One used a post office box registered by Diane's younger brother. The other had received mail through the same address before changing names. Money routed through those accounts had returned to cover hotel debt, public relations expenses, and a payment tied to one of my mother's community events. No money had gone to me. No money had purchased anything for me. The case against Diane did not rest on a miraculous digital fingerprint. It rested on the workstation ticket, her email preserving my profile, Marcus's testimony, Rosa's voicemail, the vendor addresses, the timing of the transactions, and my independent alibi. She could attack each fact separately. She could not explain all of them together. Charles had his own document problem. The auditors found the temporary retention program in a lender file. It carried his signature. The policy separated overtime, voluntary tips, and the portion of mandatory service charges that the hotel had promised employees under written agreements. Then it placed several of those amounts into a category called short-term operating reserves. Expected repayment dates appeared beside the entries. Many dates had passed without repayment. Charles could no longer claim Brielle had invented the method to pay for her wedding. She had expanded it, used it recklessly, and tracked the money in her own file. But the system had begun with him. During one settlement session, Charles looked across the table at me and said, "Every cent was meant to be restored." "From what?" I asked. "Futur revenu. That is not money employees agreed to lend you. The hotel would have failed. Then you should have told them the truth. They would have panicked. They might have left." Exactly. He did not hear the admission in his own answer. He believed preserving the business justified taking away everyone else's choices. Employees could not decide whether to stay, demand payment, or find other work because Charles believed their freedom threatened his hotel. He had spent years calling that leadership. By July, the lender had seen enough to become concerned. The hotel had not yet missed every payment, but legal costs, canceled events, and uncertain liabilities had pushed it toward covenant default. My parents entered a temporary forbearance agreement that allowed the business to keep operating while the lender monitored major cash movements. The monitor did not run the hotel. Charles remained in charge of daily operations. He simply could not move large sums, sell property, or approve unusual payments without review. That limitation enraged him more than any public insult at the wedding. By October, several couples had canceled receptions. 2 corporate clients moved conferences elsewhere. The Family Employer of the Year plaque disappeared from the lobby after the organization withdrew the award. No one could tell me who removed it. In March of 2026, the parties reached a stipulated civil judgment. There was no criminal trial. The circuit court approved an agreement requiring payment of unpaid wages, applicable additions, fees, and related civil amounts, totaling roughly $1,100,000. The judgment stated that the current records showed a systematic pattern of withheld employee compensation. It also stated that there was no evidence I had received any personal financial benefit from the disputed transactions attributed to DW01. The false vendor activity occurred after my physical access was revoked. The hotel accepted that I had not created those entries. My parents did not stand in court and apologize. They agreed to language their lawyers had spent months narrowing because continuing to fight would have exposed them to greater cost. It was not the confession I had once imagined. It was better. It was a legal record they could not rewrite at dinner parties. Brielle cooperated after obtaining counsel separate from our parents. She produced messages, notes, and the planning files she had kept. Her cooperation reduced some of her financial exposure, but it did not erase the $94,000 connected to the wedding or the 5 years she had hidden the access report. Owen ended their relationship several weeks after the failed ceremony. He did not call me for advice. He did not turn our family's collapse into a new connection between us. His attorney communicated about the unsigned marriage license and the jointly contracted vendors. There was no divorce because no marriage had been completed. By spring, the largest unanswered question was no longer whether the employees had been wronged. It was whether the Whitaker Grand could survive paying for it. The answer became uglier when counsel uncovered a letter of intent signed before the wedding. Charles and Diane had been negotiating with a developer. The proposal would have sold the lakeside land, demolished the employee housing, and converted most of the property into luxury apartments. A smaller private club would have replaced the hotel. The plan did not preserve the employees' jobs. It preserved the value of the land. Charles had withheld wages while telling everyone he was protecting the place that employed them. At the same time, he was preparing to sell the ground beneath their feet. When Rosa read the letter, she sat without speaking for nearly a minute. "My husband died believing I had protected our insurance and our jobs," she said. "They were going to sell us anyway." I did not know how to answer that. Some betrayals did not become smaller when the evidence explained them. The lender issued an additional forbearance condition in April. My parents had to refinance or arrange a sale. If they failed, the lender could seek a receiver or begin foreclosure proceedings under the loan documents. A developer submitted the highest preliminary offer. The price was attractive, but the transaction depended on zoning changes and would eliminate most hotel positions. A community investment group began exploring another structure. A local development fund would finance the real estate. An operating company would manage the hotel. An employee ownership trust would hold 51% of the operating company's voting interest, with an independent trustee and a worker council electing representatives. The structure would not make every employee rich. It would give them a formal voice, profit participation, and protection against another family using payroll as a private reserve. The offer was lower. It also required proof that the hotel could generate future business without the Whitaker name controlling it. On May 18th, the lender agreed to give the community group 30 days. They had until June 17th to show committed financing, workable governance, and at least $1,200,000 in conditional event bookings covering the next 18 months. Conditional bookings were not cash. They were signed commitments that would become contracts if the employee-led transaction closed and the hotel remained open. The lender was not choosing a buyer for my parents. Charles and Diane still owned the company and would have to sign any sale. The forbearance agreement gave them a choice. Accept a transaction capable of paying the secured debt and closing on time, or face enforcement that could leave them with less control and less money. Rosa came to my apartment that evening, carrying 2 folders. She placed them side by side on my kitchen table. The first contained the developer's proposal. It offered more money, required rezoning, and planned to tear down most of the Whitaker Grand. The second contained the community offer. It preserved the ballroom, the hotel rooms, the employee housing, and nearly every current job. It also contained a blank page labeled Booking Commitments. "We need your client relationships," Rosa said. I looked at the deadline printed on the front of the file. 30 days. The employees had spent years asking my family to pay what they owed. Now they had 1 month to prove they could keep the doors open without them. The stipulated judgment arrived on a Tuesday morning in May. My lawyer sent it through the secure client portal, with a note telling me to read the findings before the settlement numbers. I opened the document at my kitchen table, the same place where Rosa had placed the 2 competing hotel proposals weeks earlier. The language was restrained. There was no declaration that my parents had destroyed my life. No sentence called Brielle a coward or Diane a liar. Courts did not write in the language of family wounds. They wrote what could be established. The payroll corrections I entered in 2020 corresponded to documented hours, distributions, and deductions owed to specific employees. No disputed funds had entered my personal accounts. The false vendor transactions appeared after my physical access to the Whitaker Grand had been revoked. The hotel accepted that I had not created or benefited from those entries. I read those paragraphs 3 times. For nearly 5 years, I had imagined what vindication would feel like. I expected relief powerful enough to replace every conversation I had lost, every job interview where someone recognized my surname, and every night I had replayed the moment security escorted me from my own office. Instead, I felt tired. A legal record could correct the public lie. It could not return the years during which people had believed it. The judgment also listed the employees whose claims fell within the recoverable period. Older losses from 2020 remained part of the evidence showing how the system operated, but they were not added to the current wage award as though the filing deadlines had never existed. The distinction was legally necessary and emotionally unsatisfying. Truth did not always repay everything it uncovered. Charles called me that afternoon. He asked me to meet him at a private conference room in Madison. His attorney would be present, and mine could attend if I wanted. "I do," I said. My father arrived carrying a thin portfolio instead of the leather case he had brought to Brielle's wedding. He looked smaller without the hotel surrounding him, though I knew better than to confuse loss of setting with loss of will. His attorney outlined the financial situation. The stipulated judgment, professional fees, canceled events, and lender restrictions had left the family with few options. The developer's proposal offered the highest price, but rezoning and a prolonged review could delay closing. The community proposal preserved the hotel and most jobs, but it required additional commitments. Charles slid a document across the table. It proposed transferring his remaining economic interest in the operating company to me after the secured debt and employee obligations were paid. In exchange, I would help refinance the property, support a public statement describing the wage violations as management failures, rather than deliberate misconduct, and agree to preserve the Whitaker name. For a moment, the offer resembled everything I had once wanted. Control of the hotel, public recognition that I should have let it, my name restored above the entrance. Then I read the clause allowing Charles to remain an unpaid founder and strategic advisor. He was not offering me a future. He was offering me responsibility for his past while reserving a chair inside it. "You cannot transfer what is already bound by the loan and the judgment," I said. "The lender is willing to consider a family-led restructuring. If I bring the bookings, you have the relationships. And if I persuade the employees to stop speaking publicly..." His attorney intervened. "The proposal does not restrict lawful claims. It asks me to support language minimizing intent and reputational harm." Charles leaned toward me. "The employees will be paid. What else do they want? A system that cannot do this again. You can create that system. Under your name, with you advising from the corner. This hotel should have been yours. It should never have been purchased with their wages." His expression hardened. "Do not pretend you stopped wanting it. I wanted this hotel when I believed it stood for something." I closed the portfolio and pushed it back. "I do not want what you stole to become my inheritance." He stared at me as if refusal were proof that I had never deserved the offer. "You will let a developer tear it down because you need to punish us." I'm helping the employee-led proposal. That surprised him. You do not have the capital. No. That is why I am not pretending to be the buyer. You think housekeepers and banquet servers can run a hotel? I think they have been running yours for years. He left without shaking my hand. 2 days later, I returned to Lake Mercer for a meeting in the hotel's empty lakeside dining room. The community fund had not yet taken control, but the forbearance agreement allowed its representatives to inspect the property and develop a transition plan. The employees were waiting when I arrived. They did not line up as though I were receiving an award. Some sat near the windows. Others stood around the coffee station. Their apologies came in separate conversations because their silence had never had one cause. Rosa approached me first. She carried no prepared statement. Diane threatened the employer contribution and the treatment network, she said. I could not afford the full insurance premium while my husband was sick. I know, but I also knew the affidavit would help them destroy you. Her voice remained steady even when her eyes filled. I told myself you were younger, educated, and strong enough to recover. I used all the things I respected about you to make my decision easier. I did not tell her it was all right. It was not harmless because you were afraid, I said. I know. Understanding why you signed does not restore my trust. I know that too. What are you asking for? The chance to rebuild it, however long that takes. I nodded once. That is different from asking me to erase it. Yes. It was the first honest place we had found to begin. Marcus joined me near the terrace doors later that morning. I contacted you twice, he said. After the second message went unanswered, I decided you wanted nothing to do with us. You should not have had to keep chasing me. I could have tried again. I changed my number, moved, and rejected every message connected to the hotel. You thought disappearing protected us. It protected my parents. He did not soften the sentence, and I did not ask him to. I am sorry I stopped trying, he said. I am sorry I made myself impossible to reach. We did not debate whose failure had mattered more. Both had created room for the lie to survive. Maribel found me in the old lobby. She had believed the transaction summaries Diane showed her. Worse, she had repeated the story to new employees. I did not only stay quiet, she said. I told people you had mixed wage corrections with money for yourself. You knew how I worked. I trusted the title above the records. Charles owned the hotel, and Diane spoke as if she had proof. I decided that made them more believable than the person whose work I had watched for years. She looked toward the empty place where the employer award had once hung. I cannot take those words back. No, I can correct them every time I hear them repeated. That is something. Elijah waited until most people had gone to lunch. I knew the corrections matched our hours, he said. I did not believe you stole from us. Then why did you let them say it? I had 2 children and no savings. I told myself you had a degree, contacts, and somewhere else to go. He rubbed his hands together. I used your strength as an excuse for my silence. Being able to survive something does not make it acceptable to do it. I know. I would not have asked you to risk your children's home for me. That does not mean I had to help them isolate you. His apology did not make me angry. It made the past more precise. Fear had not turned everyone into a villain. It had made them choose the loss they believed they could live with. Tessa came to thank me rather than apologize. You could have displayed every pay stub in the ballroom, she said. It would have made the story clearer. It also would have exposed people who had not agreed to be exposed. You let us decide. They used your names as numbers. I was not going to do the same thing. Eddie spoke last. He found me near the front desk and placed his old brass name tag in my palm. The metal had dulled around the edges. You signed the promotion form when I became maintenance supervisor, he said. I remember. You were the first Whitaker who knew my last name before you needed something repaired. I looked at the scratched lettering. Walsh. He closed my fingers around the tag. Thank you for remembering we had names. By late afternoon, most of the group had gathered again. I did not offer collective forgiveness. I spent nearly 5 years believing your silence meant I had been wrong about all of you, I told them. Today does not remove those years. It tells me silence is no longer the only choice you are willing to make. Then we discussed the part that mattered after apologies ended. The new operating company would need an independent complaint channel. Payroll corrections above established limits would require dual approval. Workers could report violations outside the management chain. No employee would be required to appear publicly or join a legal action to keep a job. Rosa asked the question others had been avoiding. What stops you from becoming another Whitaker with better intentions? The room became quiet. It was a fair question. I had once believed good intentions justified making decisions for everyone else. A system built around my judgment alone would repeat the same weakness, even if I never intended the same harm. We do not build it around my intentions, I said. We build it so I can be challenged. The final ownership structure was simpler than the legal documents made it sound. Lakefront Community Property would purchase the land and buildings with financing from the development fund. Lakefront House Operations would lease the property and operate the hotel. An employee ownership trust would hold 51% of the voting interest in the operating company. An independent trustee would have a duty to protect the trust's purpose rather than serve one executive. A worker council elected by employees would choose 2 members of a 5-person board. The community fund would hold the remaining 49% as a non-controlling interest. I would not serve as trustee. I would receive an 18-month consulting contract to help rebuild sales, staffing, and operational controls. My authority would be limited by the board, written budgets, and independent payroll review. Some employees were relieved. A few were disappointed that ownership would not mean each person could sell a personal share for cash. The attorneys explained that the trust protected long-term control and profit participation rather than creating individual lottery tickets. It was not a perfect structure. It was a structure that did not require one family to remain benevolent forever. On June 14th, exactly 1 year after Brielle's wedding, the community fund confirmed that the basic financing commitments were in place. One condition remained. The lender required $1,200,000 in gross event booking commitments, covering the next 18 months. These were not deposits or guaranteed revenue. They were signed conditional letters from organizations prepared to book conferences, weddings, and retreats if the community transaction closed and the property passed inspection. We had 72 hours. Several former clients told us they would consider returning only if I signed the transition agreement. They trusted my operational record, but they also wanted proof that the new company would not collapse into another family power struggle. The fund's attorney placed my consulting contract in front of me. I read the governance section twice. It allowed the board to remove me for misconduct, but it gave the community fund unilateral authority to extend my contract and appoint an interim operating officer. That needs to change, I said. Rosa looked at the clock. We have 3 days. Then we should not spend them creating the next problem. I added language requiring board approval for any extension. Worker council consultation before replacing senior operations leadership and independent review of payroll complaints involving executives. The attorney warned that reopening the section could delay signatures. Then revise it now, I said. No one gets emergency power just because the deadline is frightening. 2 hours later, the corrected agreement returned. I signed it. Rosa signed for the worker council. The independent trustee acknowledged the governance terms. The fund representative signed last. Marcus entered, carrying a printed contact list, and placed it beside my pen. The first page contained organizations I had worked with during the 5 years after leaving Lake Mercer. Some had already refused to speak with the Whitaker Grand. Others had agreed to hear what the hotel might become. Rosa looked at the clock again. 72 hours remained. I picked up the list and called the first name. The first organization on Marcus's list had booked 3 executive retreats with me after I moved to Madison. Their director listened while I explained the proposed ownership structure, the independent trustee, the worker-elected board seats, the payroll controls, and my limited 18-month transition role. I told her the Whitaker family would have no management authority after closing and that the old name would come off the building. When I finished, she remained quiet long enough for me to hear the faint tapping of her keyboard. I trust you, Dana, she said. I do not trust that property. I understand. Our board read the reports. They will not approve Lake Mercer. The retreat would have been worth nearly $180,000 over 18 months. I thanked her for hearing me out and ended the call. Rosa had been standing across the sales office with a yellow legal pad pressed against her chest. She did not ask whether I could change the director's mind. She drew a line through the organization's name. 1 down, she said. Keep moving. The old sales office became our command center for the next 72 hours. We pushed 2 desks together beneath a wall of faded photographs showing weddings, corporate dinners, and holiday parties from the years when guests believed the Whitaker name represented permanence. We divided the contact list by expertise rather than status. I called former corporate clients and association planners who knew my operating record. Rosa handled groups that wanted detailed answers about housekeeping capacity, food service, room turns, and employee retention. Marcus contacted transportation partners and event vendors. Tessa prepared a concise explanation of the payroll safeguards, so clients would not have to rely on promises. No one was asked to say the new hotel would be perfect. We had already seen what happened when image became more important than fact. The first day brought 2 conditional leadership retreats and 1 regional training conference. The letters were useful, but all 3 contained escape clauses, allowing the organizations to withdraw if financing failed, inspections uncovered major problems, or the employee ownership structure changed before the event date. Conditional commitments were not deposits. They were not guaranteed revenue. The lender understood that. What mattered was that independent clients were willing to return if the transaction closed under the structure we had presented. The second day was harder. A wedding planner who had canceled 3 events after Brielle's failed ceremony refused to reconsider. My clients do not want their photographs associated with the Whitaker scandal, she told me. The Whitaker name will be removed. The ballroom is still the ballroom. She was right. We could change the sign, the board, and the payroll system. We could not order people to forget what had happened inside those walls. Another organization asked whether Charles might return as a consultant after the attention faded. No, I said. Can you guarantee that? The sale documents prohibit him and Diane from holding any management or advisory role in the operating company. And you? My contract ends after 18 months, unless the board approves an extension after consultation with the Worker Council. The planner sounded surprised. You would let them remove you? If the system depends on my permanent control, then we have not fixed the problem. That organization requested the draft governance summary. 4 hours later, it issued a conditional commitment for 2 annual conferences. By the final morning, we were still $137,000 short. No one had slept enough. Coffee cups covered the conference table. The whiteboard listed confirmed commitments, pending decisions, declined prospects, and clients who had stopped returning calls. I had begun dialing the next number when Rosa entered carrying a folder. The Midwest Hospitality Educators Association wants a video inspection, she said. 4 annual programs, guest rooms, meals, breakout rooms, and classroom space. That could cover the gap. They asked to speak with operations. She did not mean me. Rosa took the call from the head of the table. She described staffing levels, linen capacity, kitchen schedules, emergency coverage, accessible rooms, evacuation procedures, and the timeline for replacing deferred maintenance. When the association representative asked whether employees might leave during the transition, Rosa did not pretend loyalty had erased exhaustion. Some probably will, she said. They have earned the right to make that decision. We are cross-training supervisors and setting maximum room assignments so the people who remain are not punished for staying. What assurance can you give us about payroll? The representative asked. Rosa glanced toward Tessa. No employee will find a deduction on Friday that management cannot explain on Monday, she said. Exceptions will require 2 approvals, and reports involving executives will go to an independent reviewer. The association asked for an hour to confer. Those 60 minutes felt longer than the entire wedding day. At 11:42, the letter arrived. The conditional booking was worth $165,000 over 18 months. Our total reached $1,228,000. The room did not erupt into shouting. People closed their eyes, leaned back in their chairs, or released breaths they had been holding for 3 days. Tessa began checking every figure again. Rosa carried the letters to the fund's attorney. Marcus walked to the window and looked toward the circular driveway, where 10 black limousines had arrived 1 year earlier. I remained beside the phone. For years, I had believed saving a place meant being the person who made the decisive call. That morning, the condition had been satisfied because dozens of people had answered questions. I could not have answered alone. On June 17th, the lender issued conditional approval for the community transaction and began final due diligence. The developer's offer remained higher. It also depended on rezoning, environmental review, demolition plans, and a closing date that could move by several months. The employee-led proposal met the lender's payoff threshold, preserved the existing operation, and could close faster. The bank did not own the hotel and could not simply choose a buyer for my parents. Charles and Diane still controlled the ownership entity and had to sign the sale documents. The forbearance agreement limited their options. If they accepted a qualified transaction that paid the secured debt and covered the stipulated obligations, they retained whatever remained after closing costs. If they refused every workable sale, the lender could seek a receiver or begin foreclosure proceedings. Those steps would add expenses, reduce their control, and possibly leave them with less. Charles spent the next month searching for a third path. He contacted private investors. He challenged the employee judgment calculations. He proposed licensing the Whitaker name to the new operators. He offered to stay as an unpaid founder whose institutional knowledge would supposedly protect the transition. Every proposal required someone else to absorb the consequences while he preserved access to the building. No one accepted. He called me twice. I answered the second time. "You know the community offer undervalues the property," he said. "It pays the secured debt and the approved obligations." The developer offered more. "The developer cannot close on the required timeline. You could bring in another investor. Anyone using my contacts will operate under the same governance terms. You are giving control to people who have never owned anything. They have operated the hotel for years. They cleaned rooms and served food. They managed departments, trained staff, solved emergencies, retained clients, repaired your equipment, and carried the business while you moved their wages into operating reserves." His breathing changed. "You enjoy saying that." "No, I enjoy that the records say it without me." He ended the call. Final due diligence concluded in July. The closing meeting took place on July 17th in a conference room overlooking Lake Mercer. The same water that had reflected Brielle's floral arch 1 year earlier now moved beneath a gray morning sky. I attended with my attorney under the terms of my transition contract. Rosa sat beside the community fund representative. The independent trustee joined us with separate counsel. Tessa waited outside with the incoming payroll auditor because neither of them needed to be present for ownership signatures. Charles and Diane arrived separately. They had been living apart since the audit revealed that my mother had prepared documents blaming not only Brielle but also Charles. One draft described him as an aging founder whose judgment had deteriorated under debt pressure. Diane had spent years protecting him by redirecting blame. She had also prepared to abandon him when protection became inconvenient. Their marriage did not end in an afternoon. Attorneys were still negotiating separation terms and property questions. They simply no longer entered rooms as a united pair. The closing statement showed where the purchase money would go. The secured lender received payment first. Then came the stipulated judgment, approved wage obligations, taxes, professional fees, transaction expenses, and other recorded claims. My parents would receive what remained. The amount was enough to keep them comfortable. It was not enough to preserve the life Charles believed the land would finance. He reviewed the figures, then looked at me. "You can still stop this. I am not the seller. You brought the clients. A team brought them. You know what I mean." I did. He wanted me to admit that my decision had destroyed his alternatives. He wanted my refusal to become the cause of his loss, so he would not have to confront the years of choices that came before it. "The hotel is continuing," I said. "Your control is not. You think those employees will thank you when the first winter goes badly? They are not required to thank me. You think Rosa can replace me? She is not replacing you. The system is replacing the need for you." His attorney placed the signature page in front of him. Charles stared at the line bearing his name. For more than 30 years, every important decision at the Whitaker Grand had ended with his approval. That morning, his signature did not create something. It surrendered it. He signed. Diane read every page again before adding her name. When the transaction documents were confirmed, Charles removed a ring of keys from his pocket and placed it on the table. The keys did not become mine. The independent trustee accepted them for the operating structure, and handed the day-to-day operational set to Rosa, the incoming director of operations. My father watched the exchange without moving. He had expected the hotel to pass from him to one of his daughters. Even after everything, he understood succession as a family inheritance. Instead, the keys went to the woman Diane had threatened with unaffordable insurance and lost employment. Rosa closed her hand around them. Diane looked at her. "You would not have a career without this family." Rosa's expression did not change. "I had a career," she said. "Your family owned the building where I did it." My mother looked toward me, waiting for me to correct the disrespect. I said nothing. After closing, Diane's public life contracted quickly. The stipulated judgment and associated findings documented her role in keeping DW01 active, the evidence connecting the fake vendor scheme to her office, and the pressure placed on Rosa. Local charities removed her from committees. A hospital foundation declined to renew her board position. She sent letters explaining that she had acted under financial pressure and loyalty to her husband. Financial pressure did not explain why she framed me. Loyalty did not explain why she prepared Brielle as her next shield. A few weeks after the closing, Diane appeared at a private transition reception without an invitation. The gathering was not a glamorous reopening. It was a working event for employees, lenders, contractors, vendors, and community partners preparing Lakefront House for its relaunch. My mother entered through the main lobby and began telling two former donors that she had created the hotel's charitable programs. Rosa approached her holding the guest list. For several seconds, the two women looked at the page between them. "Are you asking me to leave a building I created?" Diane asked. "The new owners are holding a closed operational event," Rosa replied. "Your name is not on the list. This was my home. It was our workplace." Diane turned toward me. "Dana?" The old demand remained in the way she said my name. "Fix this. Restore the proper order. Prove you are still my daughter by protecting me from the consequence I created." I did not move. Rosa opened the front door. My mother left through it while employees watched in silence. Brielle's consequences unfolded differently. She sold jewelry, liquidated part of a personal investment account, and contributed to obligations assigned to her through the settlement. She cooperated with the accountants and produced complete access to her messages and wedding records. Her cooperation reduced some exposure. It did not erase the $94,000 linked to the wedding or the 5 years she kept the access report hidden. Owen ended their engagement several weeks after the failed ceremony. There was no divorce because the marriage license had never been signed or filed. He did not publicly humiliate her. He did not join my legal team or become an ally in my family conflict. He simply refused to marry someone who had watched an innocent person carry a lie because the lie benefited her. Brielle found work at a small marketing firm outside the hospitality industry. She no longer had a family office, hotel employees assigned to her projects, or a ballroom available whenever she wanted to impress a client. Before closing, she asked to speak to the employees. Her first apology was directed at me. I stopped her. "You used their money. Start with them." Brielle turned toward Rosa, Maribel, Elijah, Tessa, Eddie, and the others seated in the lakeside dining room. She admitted knowing that parts of the wedding budget came from payroll deductions and withheld distributions. She admitted keeping the access report because releasing it would have threatened her position. She did not describe herself as another victim of our mother. She did not ask anyone to understand what it felt like to grow up in my shadow. Some employees accepted the apology. Others remained silent. Rosa told her that repayment mattered more than tears. Elijah said he would judge her by what she did after no one was watching. Maribel asked her to correct the story publicly wherever she had repeated it. Brielle agreed. Afterward, she approached me near the empty bar. "I know you do not forgive me," she said. "I am not there. Do you think you ever will be?" I think forgiveness is the wrong first question. What is the first question? Whether you can become someone who tells the truth when it costs you something? She nodded. I agreed to meet her for coffee after the transition was complete. "That is not reconciliation," I said. "I know." For once, she did not try to negotiate a more comforting meaning. 11 days after closing, a crane arrived. That was the morning when the metal W came away from the brick facade with a groan. Charles stood across the street while the crew lowered each letter. Rosa instructed the workers to place the old sign in historical storage with the payroll records, court documents, and transition archive. It would not be displayed as a trophy. It would remain evidence of what the building had been and why its structure had changed. The new name was installed that afternoon. Lakefront House. No family surname appeared above the entrance. Lakefront Community Property owned the land and building. Lakefront House Operations leased and ran the hotel. The Employee Ownership Trust held 51% of the operating company's voting units. The Community Fund held the remaining 49% without controlling authority. An independent trustee protected the purpose of the trust. The Worker Council elected representatives to 2 seats on the 5-person board. Tessa became payroll manager under the dual approval system. She could not authorize her own exception reports. Neither could I. Marcus's company won a 1-year transportation contract after submitting the strongest qualified bid. The decision was documented by people who did not report to him or to me. My consulting agreement lasted 18 months. I could advise on sales, operations, training, and the transition. I could not unilaterally change wages, remove board members, rewrite governance, or extend my own contract. Those limits did not diminish my authority. They made it legitimate. On the first morning of employee orientation, a young banquet attendant arrived in a new uniform with a folder held against her chest. She stood near the parking lot, studying the building. "Where's the employee entrance?" she asked. The service door still existed. Deliveries needed it. Kitchen equipment needed it. Waste could not move through a lobby filled with guests. What no longer existed was the belief that the door determined who belonged. I walked with her to the front entrance and opened it. "You work here," I said. "You belong through this door." She entered beneath the Lakefront House sign. Behind her came housekeepers, servers, cooks, maintenance workers, sales coordinators, supervisors, managers, and people whose names I was still learning. Some used the front entrance. Others chose the service door because it was closer to their work area. The difference was that the choice no longer measured their value. For years, I believed justice meant proving I belonged inside the Whitaker Grand. I wanted my father to admit I had understood the hotel better than he did. I wanted my mother to admit she had chosen the wrong daughter to sacrifice. I wanted Brielle to confess that the life she inherited had been built on my disgrace. By the time the Whitaker name came off the building, none of their recognition had the power I once gave it. My final victory was not taking my father's chair. It was helping build a place where no one needed his name, my name, or anyone else's permission to belong. You should never confuse endurance with permission for others to exploit you. When people misuse your loyalty, protect yourself with records, clear boundaries, and lawful action instead of empty threats. Being strong does not mean carrying every burden alone. It means knowing when to ask for help, admit your own mistakes, and build systems that protect everyone, not just you. Forgiveness can wait until accountability is real, and family titles should never excuse theft, manipulation, or silence. Choose truth even when it costs you comfort. If this story gave you courage, subscribe to the channel for more family justice stories.